Was I expelled from Hogwarts? Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 26 The difference between people is greater than the difference between people and dogs. A good teacher cannot simply recite from the textbook, just as a university professor cannot merely read from a PowerPoint presentation, and some teachers don't even create their own PowerPoint presentations. A good teacher, besides explaining theoretical knowledge in a simple and easy-to-understand way, should also provide classic examples within the scope of the knowledge taught, allowing students to practice. This not only reinforces the knowledge learned in class but also increases interactivity and fun. Professor McGonagall, having worked in education for decades, naturally understood this principle. After explaining a long and complex theoretical explanation, she picked up a match and easily transformed it into a needle, earning applause from the young wizards. She then distributed a match to each student. Your next task is to transform your match into a needle before the end of get out of class. Whoever succeeds will earn 5 points for their house. The young wizards excitedly busied themselves with the task of transforming the match, but while watching Professor McGonagall demonstrate seemed simple, trying it themselves proved to be a completely different story. She either forgot the spell or couldn't remember the wand-waving motion, and even when she got both right, the match didn't change at all, not even its color. Susan Barnes tried several times confidently but failed each time. Her arm movements were too large, and the wand accidentally got stuck in Hannah's pigtails. Barnes looked at her hand in confusion, then excitedly shouted, "Hannah, Hannah! I think I accidentally invented the vanishing charm, and made the wand disappear." Look, look! Hannah ignored Barnes's shouts. She was completely focused on the match, constantly chanting "I am transmutation theory." Barnes leaned closer, wanting to see Hannah's work, only to be struck on the forehead with her wand with a crisp crack. The force was definitely not light, leaving a red mark. Tears and snot streamed down Barnes' face. Hannah quickly covered her mouth, pleading pitifully, "Don't cry. If Professor McGonagall hears you, I'll be kicked out. I lost my wand. I'll buy you a new one." Barnes, being ruthless, snorted and forcefully pulled the too snotty snot back into his nose. After several failures, Justin became somewhat agitated, falling into a state of rage akin to losing a dozen games in a row and wanting to smash the computer screen. Of course, he didn't have a screen. He really wanted to break a wand, of course, someone else's wand. "Pearl, lend me your wand for a moment." "No way. My wand is my little girlfriend." Macmillan, sitting in the last row, refused. "Would you be willing to lend your girlfriend to someone else to play with?" "Of course." "Then I'll still refuse." "You don't have a girlfriend." "But I really do have a wand." Macmillan shook his head. "Besides, I still need to turn it into matches." "Then go ahead and do it," Justin exclaimed speechlessly. "I've seen you spacing out for almost 5 minutes. That's enough time for me to fail 7 times. I'm just worried that if I succeed, and I'm that fast, will I attract all the girls' attention?" Macmillan rested his chin on his hand, gazing out the window, and said wistfully, "Justin, if they find out I'm so outstanding, they all want to date me. How can I refuse without hurting them?" Justin really wanted to slap Macmillan's face with his size 37 feet, which hadn't been washed for 2 days and 2 nights, to wake him up. Fortunately, Professor McGonagall arrived. With a dark face, she took her wand and tapped Macmillan on the head 3 times. After Professor McGonagall left, Justin couldn't help but sneer. "Serves you right for being so cocky." Macmillan sighed again, shaking his finger. "You don't understand. Professor McGonagall is hinting that I should go to her room at 3 a.m. Looks like she's going to teach me her most powerful transfiguration. What do you think? Should I go?" Neville failed for the 58th time, but he wasn't discouraged. He swung his wand again, landing it on a match, but the match suddenly burst into flames, almost setting his wand on fire. Ravenclaw, perched on Neville's head, was enjoying the sunshine. Seeing this, he cawed smugly. Neville had already decided to take Ravenclaw to Ralph's for ADHD treatment at noon. He'd heard it involved removing some organ, like a cat's testicles, a permanent cure. The Ravenclaw Hawks weren't performing much better than the Hufflepuff students. Many students were sorted into several houses simultaneously. Being sorted into Ravenclaw didn't necessarily mean they were smarter than students from other houses. Aside from a few geniuses, most wizards are ordinary people with little difference in intelligence. Those diligent Ravenclaw students who had only previewed the theoretical knowledge were just as bad in actual combat. Of course, some clever eagles had inquired beforehand and knew that Professor McGonagall habitually taught how to transform matches into needles. They secretly brought their own needles and pretended to successfully transform. Unfortunately, Professor McGonagall saw through them immediately, dragged them to the corner by the ear as punishment, and deducted 5 points. The most unexpected was Sherry, who was the first to complete the transformation, taking only 3 minutes. Professor McGonagall praised Sherry highly, adding 5 points to her score. Ralph didn't rush to act. He was browsing his textbook, already flipping to Chapter 1, Section 4. Ralph had previewed Transfiguration at home long ago, reading through a lot of material, but he hadn't understood many parts of the theoretical knowledge. Now, the parts he hadn't understood during his preview instantly became clear, and Ralph was even confident that the parts that had previously been difficult to transform were now a piece of cake. This feeling was like a math problem he couldn't even understand when he was a poor student. Now, equipped with Professor McGonagall's transfiguration talent, his comprehension had instantly risen several levels. He only needed a quick glance, his thoughts were clear, and he could even think of possible variations of the problem. Was this Professor McGonagall's talent? Terrifying. When he turned to the second chapter, Shirley lightly tapped Ralph's foot. The boy looked up and saw Professor McGonagall standing not far away, staring at him with a deathly gaze. Of course, to prevent him from having a fit, Professor McGonagall's voice was exceptionally gentle. Mr. Scamander, I've only reached the second section, and you've already turned to the second chapter. Does this mean you can skillfully turn a match into a needle, just like Miss Swinton? The students all excitedly looked up. Here it comes. Is Scamander going to be the first student kicked out by Professor McGonagall? But Ralph nodded and smiled. Yes, Professor, I have completed your task. He took his wand and gently tapped the match, which immediately transformed into a fine needle with a small hole at one end for threading. Sherry rested her elbow on the table, propped her chin on her hand, glanced at Ralph, and smiled. She knew he was doing it on purpose, just waiting for Professor McGonagall to cause trouble. How cunning. Professor McGonagall was taken aback. In all her years of teaching, she hadn't seen two transfiguration geniuses in the same class for a long time. The last time was with James Potter and Sirius Black. She immediately became interested and wanted to test just how strong Ralph and Sherry's talents were. Professor McGonagall took out several matches. She waved her wand, and the matches first transformed into silver needles, then bent 90 degrees. Why don't you two try this? Sherry closed her eyes and recalled Professor McGonagall's movements. She quickly completed the transfiguration again, taking the same 3 minutes. Ralph was a bit faster, succeeding within a minute. Professor McGonagall tapped the curved silver needle, which twisted like a silver snake, eventually transforming into a spring. Ralph was slightly slower this time, but Sherry still finished in 3 minutes. In fact, Ralph was faster than Sherry because he had previewed this part of the lesson long ago. Coupled with Professor McGonagall's talent, he had completely mastered many things he didn't understand at the time. Sherry, on the other hand, hadn't studied it at all. She had simply watched Professor McGonagall's movements and imitated them, learning as she went. So, when the fourth transformation touched upon Ralph's blind spots, the situation began to change. He still learned quickly, but not as fast as Sherry. The fifth transformation was even more so. Professor McGonagall nodded in satisfaction, looking at Sherry as if she were a rough gem. This child had grown up in a monastery and was an orphan, never having been exposed to wizards before, yet she possessed such outstanding talent in transfiguration. The most outstanding transfiguration genius she had ever seen was Nymphadora Tonks, but Tonks was a natural-born disguise magus. That was practically Merlin's gift. Others might be fed, but she was practically forced into it. Sherry's talent for transfiguration seemed no less than Tonks. As for Ralph, his talent was probably similar to his own back then, not comparable to Sherry and Tonks, but not bad either. The students craned their necks, watching Ralph and Sherry's performance, utterly dumbfounded. They were all little wizards, so why was the difference between them so vast, like that between a person and a dog? Thanks to Orland's round-faced fat chicken for the 10,000 coin donation. Thanks to Yami for the donation. Chapter 27 Celia's Magical Animal Shop. When get out of class ended, Professor McGonagall kept Rolf and Sherry behind and took them to her office. Rolf thought Professor McGonagall wanted to give him private lessons, to teach him some powerful transfiguration techniques, but instead, she gave him an old textbook and then kicked him out, leaving only Sherry, for a private lesson. Rolf stood at the office door, casually flipping through the textbook, and discovered that it was one of Professor McGonagall's old ones. Although it was old and the pages were yellowed, it was well preserved. The corners of the textbook were filled with notes, all of Professor McGonagall's thoughts when she encountered problems. Putting everything else aside, her Spencerian handwriting was truly beautiful and pleasing to the eye. As the saying goes, handwriting reflects the person. Although Professor McGonagall is now older and seems aged, who wasn't once a gentle, bright, and charming young woman? As for the words cursing Slytherin Quidditch team to never win a championship written in a small corner of the textbook, along with Scottish slang insults directed at the two batters, it was certainly harsh and vulgar, far from gentle and charming, but Ralph was wearing McGonagall contact lenses and couldn't see them. Besides, Snape had deducted 5 points from him last night, so he was clearly not a good person, and deserved it. After a moment, the office door opened again, and Shirley came out. Seeing Ralph still engrossed in his book, she coughed lightly, and the boy turned around. The girl with the ponytail smiled and nodded. The two walked side by side toward the Great Hall. By now, the students were already eating in the Great Hall. Hogwarts professors didn't have the habit of extending class time, so there weren't many young wizards in the corridors, making it unusually quiet. Seeing the boy remain silent, Shirley spoke up. Professor McGonagall asked me to come see her every Wednesday evening. Just you alone, Ralph asked with a resentful look. It's not that Professor McGonagall thinks I'll hold you back, that's why she doesn't call me, is it? Shirley tilted her head, looking surprised, seemingly astonished at how the boy knew. She quickly added, her tone sincere, it's not that I'll hold you back. Professor McGonagall said you might fall behind, and she's worried it might damage your confidence. Ralph felt a knife to his heart. Ouch! He couldn't stand those words. Professor McGonagall, you can look down on me, but you can't look down on your own talent. I'm using your transfiguration talent. But it's fine, anyway, this transfiguration talent is only valid for a month. Going to Professor McGonagall's every week will expose his true abilities after a few lessons. Rolf didn't want to go at all, it was a waste of time. Sour. Shirley coughed, suppressing a laugh, and whispered, Professor McGonagall even asked me if you were really sick. What did you answer? Rolf asked nervously. Had Professor McGonagall's sweet talk really made Shirley betray him and reveal all his secrets? Of course, I told the truth. The girl with the ponytail smiled gently, a hint of slyness in her voice. Depression, hereditary autism, social anxiety, taking medication year-round, weak, just what you said on the train. Rolf breathed a sigh of relief. Wait a minute, when did she say she was weak? But Professor McGonagall said she's going to have Mrs. Pomfrey take a look at you. If it doesn't work, she'll advise you to quit and go home to recuperate for 2 years. Seeing Rolf take a deep breath, Sherry smiled and lowered her voice, explaining softly, Professor McGonagall was joking. She asked me to tell you to carefully review your notes in the textbook, they were written by her before. She also said that if you don't understand anything, you can ask me. Thank you for your help, Rolf said gratefully. The two quickly entered the noisy Great Hall. Sherry stopped and thought for a moment, then said, Oh, right, there was something I lied to you about earlier. What did you say? Rolf looked blank. The girl didn't answer. She raised her beautiful, willow leaf-shaped eyes, turned her back to the boy, waved goodbye, and then, swaying her ponytail, walked towards the Ravenclaw table. The events of the Transfiguration class had already spread throughout the school. As the only one who dared to tease Professor McGonagall, Rolf received many admiring glances. On his short walk to the Hufflepuff table, people kept rising to shake his hand, as if he were a victorious hero. Lee somehow produced a banner that read in black ink, Love of, Cheers. The Weasley twins even came over to bow in respect, expressing their highest reverence. Seeing that Professor McGonagall wasn't there, George recited like a bard, The great Scamander has accomplished a magnificent feat we've always wanted to do, but dared not. He has survived the claws of the Gryffindor lioness. This is a great victory. His heroism will live on forever at Hogwarts. Fred somehow produced a small red flower, tucked it into Lavrov's pocket, and loudly proclaimed, "Mr. Scamander, on behalf of George, I award you the Weasley Brothers Recognition Award." In just one day at Hogwarts, Lavrov had already proven with his actions that he was truly the bravest man in Hufflepuff. Rove struggled through the crowd towards the Hufflepuff table. Neville had already saved him a seat, sandwiched between him and Hannah again. As Rove approached, he pulled a wand from the little girl's pigtails. "Hannah, what's with this weird hairstyle?" he asked, puzzled. Hannah stared at the wand in confusion, then quickly snapped, "Susan, you jerk. You stuck a wand in my hair. It's probably the effect of a vanishing charm," Burns said, snatching the wand from Hannah's hand and grinning. "Thanks for finding it for me," Hannah glared at him. "Give me back my allowance. I only agreed to raise money for you because you said you lost your wand. I earned the money myself. Why should I give it back?" Burns turned and ran. Hannah, her pigtails swinging, chased after him menacingly. Neville was dumbfounded. How could the gentle, shy girl from last night have changed so much today? Filch approached, carrying Mrs. Loris, his eyes gleaming with dark circles, as if he'd been up all night. Filch looked terrible. He'd gone to Diagon Alley that morning, the wizard at the magical creatures shop had examined her, and the illness was exactly as Ralph had described. But the price was a month's salary, and there was no guarantee of a cure. Pet hospitals in his previous life were expensive, often costing thousands or even tens of thousands, far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The magical creatures shop in the wizarding world was no exception, a veritable money pit. Therefore, being a magical creature veterinarian was a lucrative profession. "Scamander, can you even cure her?" Filch's voice was hoarse. Seeing students gathering around, Ralph exclaimed, "Of course I can. As my first customer, I'll even treat you for free." Mrs. Loris was a perfect advertisement. She was currently emaciated, and Ralph not only wanted to cure her but also fatten her up like a pig. Besides, if he built a good relationship with Filch, perhaps they could turn a blind eye to his nighttime outings in the future, right? Ralph cupped his hands to his mouth and whistled a loud note, not very loud, almost drowned out by the students' chatter. A sharp bird call suddenly rang out, and a yellow bird swooped down from afar, a small black leather case hanging from its ankle. The bird was so beautiful that all the students looked up, curiously peering at it. The small, adorable shrew flew over quickly, abruptly landing on Ralph's shoulder, affectionately stroking the boy's cheek with its beak. "Good boy, Trax," Ralph patted its head. The shrew looked up, excited to see so many students watching it, and prepared to sing its heart out. Ralph took the case off, gently patted the shrew's head, and said with a bright smile, "You can't sing here. Go play with the sorting hat. It likes to hear people sing. Go sing for it, it's in the headmaster's office." The shrew lightly pecked Ralph's earlobe, then spread its wings and vanished in a flash. Ralph opened the black leather case and took out the potions he had prepared long ago. He instructed, "This is a nasal drop potion made from ethylparaben, salt, and a small amount of alcohol. Take it back and drip it into Mrs. Loris's nose 3 times a day. This is a mixture of ephedra, licorice, and trichosammed fruit. It tastes a bit unpleasant. You can add some honey and feed it to Mrs. Loris." Ralph wrote the instructions on the paper with flowing strokes, and finally said solemnly, "Avoid spicy and pungent foods, and do not eat fish." Filch took the paper, his hands trembling as he stared at Ralph's handwriting. He wasn't excited, nor happy, but he couldn't understand it at all. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28 Picture Planned. As a qualified doctor, one's handwriting must be flowing and unpredictable, so much so that patients won't understand it, otherwise they'll think you're unprofessional and a fraud. Although veterinarians deal with animals, they also interact with wizards, so the handwriting naturally needs to be elegant. While Ralph was writing a prescription for Madame Norris, many students gathered around. Seeing the messy handwriting on the note, a knowledgeable student immediately praised his medical skills. "See? That's what professionalism looks like. The other person definitely wasn't a shill." Filch thanked him profusely and left with a potion. Ralph then announced the official opening of Celia's magical creatures shop. On the train, he had only mentioned that he planned to post advertisements on the bulletin boards in the various house lounges today. Gryffindor had Hermione, Ravenclaw had Sherry, Slytherin had Malfoy. He didn't need to go to other houses, someone would help with a promotion. Of course, Slytherin was a bit more dangerous, since Snape wasn't a good person, so Malfoy would have to be the one handing out cards to each dormitory. When the boss's shop opened, Neville, as the underling, immediately responded, offering his pet Raffer to help with business. Rolf was delighted. He still remembered the spell called Tongue Whip, which, combined with the bag spider's mana replenishment, was a divine combination. Rolf took the struggling toad, which was trying to escape, and placed it in a small cage made of vines. "Look how happy Raffer is, Neville. Don't worry about him, I'll cure Raffer's ADHD and keep him by your side forever, he won't run off," Rolf promised. Just then, an owl flew over, soaring through the great hall to the Hufflepuff table and dropping a red letter on Neville's head. Neville, who had just been quite happy, instantly felt his joy turn to sorrow. He cried out, "Oh no! My grandma sent me a howling letter. She must be angry that I didn't go to Gryffindor but came to Hufflepuff instead." The smoking red letter had barely appeared in the Great Hall when many students laughed gleefully. Receiving a howling letter was always their happiest moment. At the Gryffindor table, Harry asked curiously, "What's that?" Everyone seemed so excited. "A howling letter. Believe me, Harry, you don't want to know what it is." Ron shook his head. "A howling letter amplifies a person's voice dozens of times. You can hear it hundreds of meters away. While not very harmful, it's extremely insulting and can cause social death to the recipient. My mother used to make howling letters for George and Fred," Ron recalled fearfully. "They played pranks at school, and Professor McGonagall wrote home. My mother had a gloomy face all day, and at dinner time, she burned the porridge. My father and I didn't dare say a word and just ate the burnt porridge. My mother always told me not to learn from Fred and George, my foolish brother. Talking behind people's backs like that is not a good habit." George suddenly appeared and put his arm around Ron's neck. "Yet, do we really have to expose everything you've done?" Fred shook his head and laughed. "Who is it that wet the bed when they were 7 and insisted it was the ghouls in the attic? Poor old Radish, it's hard enough for him to get down from the attic, how could he climb into your bed? Who is it that got hemorrhoids when they were 9 and bled all over their pants? And insisted on telling their mother that they had their period?" George and Fred's voices were loud enough for all the students at the Gryffindor desks to hear, and even Harry couldn't help but laugh out loud. "I'm going to kill you. I'm going to fuck you to death," Ron roared, charging at the twins, ready to fight them to the death. At this moment, smoke began to rise from the four corners of the howling letter, making a hissing sound like boiling water. If it wasn't opened in time, it would explode, making an even louder, more piercing sound. Many of the badger cubs moved away from the table, and Neville, looking terrified, cried out to Ron for help. "What do we do? Watch me." Ron opened the small black leather case, threw the struggling Raffer and the howling letter inside, then closed the lid and turned the knob. Many experienced students thought Scamander had gone mad. In a small, enclosed space, the explosion would be twice as powerful. Even a small case could blow you to bits. But to everyone's bewilderment, as time passed, the howling letter didn't seem to explode at all, and no sound came from inside the case. Was it a dud? "Ron always manages to create something unexpected," Fred remarked in amazement. "Yet, if we had that case back then, we wouldn't have been bombarded with howling letters by Mom," George said. "That's not all," Parvati Petal, of Indian descent, interjected. "My sister and Ravenclaw said that in their morning transfiguration class, only Scamander and Swinton completed Professor McGonagall's assignment. Scamander is really amazing. Our dorm has already decided to go see him for our pets this weekend," Ravenclaw chuckled sheepishly. Ron, now subdued, sat back down next to Harry. Listening to their conversation, he suddenly remembered Scabbers in his pocket. "Should I go see Ronf too? Scabbers is so old, if it's cheap, I could get it a full-body treatment," Ron thought. By the end of lunch, Ronf had received many appointments. He realized he couldn't handle it all alone and needed a capable female assistant. Not necessarily beautiful, but definitely competent. The afternoon herbalism class was with the Gryffindor students. After all, he was their headmaster. The Badgers had just finished eating and left the castle, crossing the vegetable garden towards the greenhouse. Professor Sprout stood at the greenhouse entrance, wearing a small purple felt hat, a patched cap covering her flowing hair, and her clothes smeared with mud. Having just chased away a badger, she still held a pitchfork in her hand, looking somewhat like a simple-minded person. Once most of the students had arrived, Professor Sprout called out loudly, "Children, today we're going to the first greenhouse, but before we go in, I have something to tell you, something you'll all remember for the next few years. Don't touch the magical plants carelessly. Most of them are very fragile and vulnerable, and some are poisonous and aggressive. No plant may be touched without my permission. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Professor Sprout took a large key from her belt, opened the greenhouse door, and led everyone inside. They stood in an open space, directly in front of them growing magical plants. A warm breeze swept through, filling the air with the fragrance of earth and the smell of freshly applied dragon manure fertilizer. Led by Professor Sprout, the students walked through a cluster of mushrooms almost the size of their heads and came to a strangely shaped plant. The plant was about a meter tall, with broad leaves, at the tips of which were vase-shaped fruits with lids. "Does anyone know what this is?" Before Sprout could even finish her sentence, and before many had even heard her question, Hermione, standing not far from Ralph, had already raised her hand high. "Miss Granger, this is a crimson pitcher plant, which has a unique organ for absorbing nutrients." The pitcher, Hermione recited fluently. The pitcher is cylindrical, slightly bulging at the bottom, and has a lid on the opening. It gets its name from its resemblance to a pitcher. "Very good, 2 points for Gryffindor." Professor Sprout blinked, pointed to the liquid inside the pitcher plant's vase-like structure, and smiled. "This is the liquid secreted by the crimson pitcher plant, a very sweet and harmless sap. It's also one of the raw materials for sizzling honey. I've tasted it before, it tastes very good." Hearing her say this, the young wizards all wanted to taste it. Professor Sprout happened to turn her back, seemingly looking for something, and immediately a group of students reached out and dipped their hands in the sap. "It's so sweet, Harry, you should try some." Ron licked his thumb. "Indeed, it's the first time I've ever eaten something so sweet," Harry whispered. Ron noticed many black, granular objects floating in the sap. He scooped up several, tasted them, and found them sweet, like jelly beans. Harry followed suit and ate a few. Neville was about to try some when Ron slapped his hand away. Seeing Ron's action, Hermione, who had been curious, immediately gave up after a moment's hesitation. Justin raised his hand and asked, "Professor Sprout, what are those black pearl-like things floating in the sap?" "Oh, that's the excrement of a pitcher plant." Professor Sprout turned around, grinning. The pitcher plant has evolved a unique sap to attract animals to taste it, and their excrement serves as fertilizer for the pitcher plant. Look at its shape, doesn't it look like a toilet? Isn't it amazing? Chapter 29 New Uses for Pitcher Plants. The young wizards initially thought the pitcher plant was cute, perfect for planting by their bedsides, providing a natural, self-service sweet drink when thirsty. But after Professor Sprout's reminder, the more they looked at it, the more it resembled a toilet, and with the floating animal droppings, it looked even more like a clogged toilet. Harry and Ron bent over and gagged, not only tasting the sweet juice but also eating the vixen's droppings. Ron, being a good older brother, even collected some and put them in his pocket, planning to send them home for his sister Ginny to try. Wait, Ron vaguely remembered that the year the twins left home for school, they brought back a lot of candy for Christmas, telling him not to let their mother see it. Could it be this stuff? Those two bastards. Gagged, like yawns, was contagious, and soon the sounds came in waves, one after another, with many young wizards having tasted it to varying degrees. Neville looked at Ron gratefully, while Hermione patted her chest with lingering fear, then glared angrily at Ron. "You warned Neville, but not me? We've known each other for ages. Luckily, I was more careful." Ralph was innocent too, honestly. He really thought Hermione knew it was vixen feces, never imagining she had such blind spots. "Why is vixen feces sweet?" Neville asked curiously, seeing everyone enjoying their food. "The sap of the scarlet pitcher plant is very sweet, it's one of the ingredients for sizzling honey. The feces soak for a long time, they absorb the flavor, of course they're sweet," Ralph explained quietly. "Also, some animals have very poor digestion, and their feces are rich in nutrients and are edible. They pose no harm to the body, just a little disgusting." "That's right, Mr. Scamander. If I were your professor of magical creatures, I would definitely give you 2 extra points." Professor Sprout walked over, carrying a stack of small sticks, which she placed on the table. Looking at the group of students gagging, she calmly said, "Did you hear that? The fox spirit's feces are harmless, so don't worry about your health. But before we entered the greenhouse, I told you not to touch the magical plants unless I gave permission." Remember, many students lowered their heads in shame. After all, less than 5 minutes had passed, and they had promised so readily, only to forget it in the blink of an eye. Knowledge isn't written on paper, it's internalized. Professor Sprout looked at everyone, tapping her head. For your safety, I'll emphasize again, do not touch magical plants, especially those you don't understand. This is the first herbalism lesson I'll teach you, and the most important one. Even if you forget everything I've taught you after graduation, just remember this. Ralph looked at Professor Sprout with admiration. Despite her always patched, thick hat, earthy smell, and rustic appearance, unlike the always jeweled, fashionable, and alcohol-smelling divination Professor Trelawney next door, she was actually a very wise witch. Our Hufflepuff graduates are excellent. Of course, Hufflepuff dropouts are even more excellent. Professor Sprout clapped his hands. Alright, children, let's begin the lesson. Who can tell me what the pitcher plant's root is used for? Ralph felt a gust of wind brush past his ear, and a hand shot up. Miss Granger, Hermione looked up and answered, the pitcher plant's root is the main ingredient in the forget-me-not potion. Drinking it makes one forget all sorrow. Very good, 5 points for Gryffindor. Professor Sprout nodded, a hint of melancholy in his voice. All his students were standing there, seemingly lost in thought. If only she had students so good at earning house points, Hufflepuff would have no trouble winning the house cup. Hermione grinned, revealing her 2 front teeth. Seeing Ralph glance over, she immediately pursed her lips, glared at the boy, and raised an eyebrow, seemingly challenging him to a contest of who could earn more house points. Ralph ignored the childish girl. He quietly observed the greenhouse, checking what he lacked. After all, he couldn't leave the treasure vault empty-handed. He was here to buy supplies, and incidentally, to give a lesson. Teaching you how to brew the forget-me-not potion is Professor Snape's job, Professor Sprout said, pointing to a row of shovels in the distance. Your task is to learn how to loosen the soil around pitcher plants, but be careful, their roots are very fragile. Even slight damage will cause them to attack wizards violently. Everyone turned to look at the row of gleaming shovels. What happened to not having to farm? Each of you gets a shovel and a stick. Watch how I loosen the soil. Professor Sprout picked up a stick and gently wedged it into the pitcher plant's toilet-shaped cylinder. She put on dragon skin gloves, grabbed the shovel, and began loosening the soil around the pitcher plant. Professor Sprout was definitely an experienced farmer. Her technique was superb. She loosened the soil around the plant without damaging its roots at all. Alright, everyone, follow these steps. Make sure the stick is wedged into the pitcher plant's cylinder. The young wizards began selecting sticks, shovels, and the preferred pitcher plants. Ralph chose a larger pitcher plant. After securing it with a stick, he took a rainbow fish from a lining of his robe and dropped it into the sap. The rainbow fish is a small, spherical fish with 2 long, webbed feet. It lives in deep lakes and feeds on water snails. Its belly is like a sponge, capable of absorbing large amounts of water without changing its shape much. Squeezing its belly will release the water. The rainbow fish is small and doesn't take up much space. Wizards traveling in the desert usually carry one with them as a good solution for water shortages. Therefore, the rainbow fish absorbed most of the pitcher plant's sap in an instant, and the stick effectively prevented the pitcher plant from swallowing it. Ralph didn't drink the sap, but his little darlings in his box loved it. Removing the sap wouldn't harm the pitcher plant, it would recover in 2 nights at most. Hermione and Neville were dumbfounded. What kind of operation was this? Just then, strange noises came from outside the greenhouse. Professor Sprout picked up her fork and muttered, "Another weasel causing trouble." After Professor Sprout left, the entire greenhouse erupted in chaos. Hannah and Burns started fighting with sticks, Hannah still demanding her galleons. Justin, taking advantage of the fact that no one was looking, quietly picked up some fox spirit droppings, put them in his mouth, and started chewing. He loved the taste, the chewiness. Ron was chatting with Harry, discussing how to trick the twins into eating fox spirit droppings. He was distracted, and the small stick didn't get stuck in the pitcher plant's toilet-shaped cylinder. "I'll put it in the bread, then you hand the bread to George and Fred. They definitely won't be on guard." Ron envisioned his successful revenge. He picked up the shovel and shoveled directly into the pitcher plant's rootstock. The pitcher plant roared in fury, its toilet-shaped cylinder snapping open and swallowing him whole. Harry turned around and found Ron gone. Pitcher plants don't just eat feces, they're also carnivorous. Animals swallowed by it slide into the pitcher, drown in the liquid secreted at the bottom, and are broken down into nutrients, gradually being digested and absorbed. Ron, Harry yelled, grabbing Ron's legs and pulling him out like a radish. A group of students lined up behind him, pulling Harry back, while the pitcher plant sucked him in with all its might. For a moment, it looked like a tug-of-war, with half of Ron's body going in and out of the pitcher plant. Many students who had given up on planting pitcher plants suddenly had a bright idea. They seemed to have discovered a new use for them. This was a great thing. The two were deadlocked. Ron walked over and scratched the area under the pitcher plant's leaves, as if tickling its armpit. The pitcher plant immediately trembled and ejected Ron, who was covered in sticky liquid and lying on the ground, bubbling. "Ron, are you alright?" Harry rushed over and asked. Ron burped. Sweet, Professor Sprout, who had heard the commotion, had rushed back. Seeing this, she sighed and said, "The pitcher of a pitcher plant is its sensitive area, its weakness." Mr. Scamander saved his classmate. Very good. Hufflepuff, 15 points, the students applauded enthusiastically. Ron glanced at Hermione, raised his eyebrows, as if to say, "Your answering the question only earns you effort points, worthless. Look, I've earned more points in one go than you did in half a class." Hermione rubbed her chest, annoyed. I used a certain word that was blocked when I posted the chapter, so I had to make some changes. Sigh. Chapter 30 Rove's Greenhouse. Ron's misfortune completely demoralized the young wizards, who dared not misbehave anymore and diligently loosened the soil. But digging was physically demanding, and for the young wizards who had never done this kind of work before, it was torture. By the end of get out of class, they left the greenhouse drenched in sweat. Ron, however, didn't leave. Instead, he volunteered to stay and help Professor Sprout clean the greenhouse. Seeing that Ron hadn't left, Neville also stayed to help. Hermione, carrying a heavy backpack, hesitated before leaving the greenhouse with the Gryffindor students, but soon came skipping back. "I left something behind," she poked her fluffy little head out, pretending to search like a hen pecking at food, and quickly joined the cleaning team. Ron then assumed that the thing she had left was probably him and Neville. Actually, there wasn't much to clean. Besides putting the shovels and sticks back in their places, the biggest task was checking the pitcher plant's roots for any damage. This was the first time Professor Sprout had encountered a young wizard willing to stay and help after class, which made her feel somewhat gratified and touched. Professor Sprout looked up at the blond boy and asked with a smile, "Rolf, how is your grandfather, Mr. Scamander, doing lately?" "He's doing well." Deep in the Albanian forest, he discovered the catfox, a species long thought extinct, Rolf said, examining the pitcher plant. "He's busy helping this species thrive. No wonder he's Mr. Scamander," Professor Sprout exclaimed, her expression one of admiration, a mature female student gazing at an older male senior. "I've always considered him the greatest magizoologist in the world." "My grandfather wouldn't agree, Professor," Rolf said, pulling a stick from the pitcher plant's cylinder and grinning. "He'll tell you, he only did some minor work, Mr. Scamander is always so humble, but that's precisely the most outstanding quality of Hufflepuff," Professor Sprout sighed. "Although he was expelled back then, in my heart, it wasn't his loss, but Hufflepuff's loss." Professor Sprout was probably a professional Newt fanboy. Ralph was a little embarrassed. Was this the same eccentric old man he usually saw, who was withdrawn, taciturn, liked to tell corny jokes, and always had some strange metaphors? Professor Sprout walked over to pitcher plant, looked down, and found that the sap inside was gone. She muttered under her breath, "Who took it? It couldn't have been one of our Hufflepuff students, could it?" "Impossible, my students are all honest and kind, they wouldn't do such a thing." Hermione and Neville, who were picking up sticks nearby, glanced at Ralph. Hermione, struggling to suppress her laughter, opened her mouth and silently said, "Professor Sprout says you're not honest." Ralph rolled his eyes at her and quickly changed the subject. "Professor, what happened outside?" "I saw you rushing out." Professor Sprout became annoyed at the mention of this. She said irritably, "Lately, a bunch of badgers have been appearing in the Forbidden Forest, harassing my greenhouse and stealing herbs." "Could they be Hagrid's?" Ralph asked suspiciously. "I thought so at first, but when I asked Hagrid, he said he didn't keep any and didn't know why." Professor Sprout shook his head. "Those beasts probably came from deep within the Forbidden Forest," the witch clearly disliked the magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest, as they threatened her fragile herbs. Professor Sprout insisted that Hogwarts should build a wall to isolate it from the Forbidden Forest. Ralph seemed thoughtful. He had never seen such arrogant harpies before, and he could lure them into his box. "By the way, I noticed your rock lovers seem to have withered quite a bit since the summer holidays. Those rock lovers have been infected with anthrax wilt. I've tried everything, but I can't kill them, Professor Sprout said, looking worried. Rock lovers are perennial herbaceous magical plants native to Greece, used to treat wounds and healing them, even more effective than dandelion, making them very precious. Sprout paused for a moment, then sighed. Professor Snape isn't an expert in herbal medicine, and I haven't found a good solution yet. If we can't find a cure, this batch of rock loaves might all die. That's how plant diseases are. When they get severe, they can easily lead to the extinction of an entire species. Like bananas. Decades ago, the world primarily ate a variety called giant mac, not the current Wallash. Giant mac bananas were much larger, sweeter, and tastier than Wallachs, but with a Fusarium oxysporum infection, they essentially disappeared. Professor Sprout, actually, I have a way to cure rock loaves, Ralph chuckled softly. This plant disease first appeared in Central Asia and then spread to Europe. They started researching solutions there a long time ago. My grandfather and I discovered a potion made from Hogwarts juice that can kill this bacteria. Hermione, who had been listening intently to their conversation nearby, raised an eyebrow. She remembered arguing with Ralph about the uses of Hogwarts on the train. Has it been verified? Professor Sprout asked hurriedly. Yes, we also submitted it to the International Journal of Wizarding Potions, but it's still under review. You know, top-tier journals like this have very slow review processes, Ralph said with a smile. I can brew some for you soon. Would you like to try it? Okay. Professor Sprout tucked his hands into his sleeves, his smile broad, and asked, do you have enough raw materials? You can get anything you need from me. I have plenty of herbs. For one thing, I don't need the herbs, but I'm short of seeds. Professor, Ralph finally revealed his true purpose for coming. I'd like some herb seeds. Is that alright? No problem. Just tell me which seeds you want, and I'll get them for you. Professor Sprout thought there would only be a few seeds, maybe a dozen at most, but to his surprise, Ralph pulled out a piece of parchment about 15 or 16 inches long from his pocket. Ralph handed over the A3-sized parchment. Despite being covered in densely packed names, it contained many seeds he had collected while in Romania. Ralph needed seeds that were difficult to buy elsewhere, many were contraband and required Ministry of Magic permits. Professor Sprout looked at the list on the parchment, tracing it with his wand, and said, some I can't give you, like the devil's web, it's too dangerous for you. Well, Ralph did collect the devil's web for combat. He could accelerate and control plant growth. Ordinary vines were too weak to match the devil's web and the whomping willow. But it didn't matter. Ralph remembered there was devil's web on the 4th floor of the Forbidden Zone. He could just go there sometime and get it all. After tidying up the greenhouse, the group said goodbye to Professor Sprout and headed towards the Great Hall. What do you need the seeds for? Hermione asked curiously. Many herbs can cure magical creatures, and buying them is too expensive, so I'd rather grow them myself, Ralph explained. Like the four-leaved lycopodium, it can treat bacillary dysentery and acute enteritis. The long-stalked pyelonephritis can treat acute and chronic nephritis and pyelonephritis. The woolly scaly fern and many of its close relatives can treat liver leech disease, etc. If he kept buying ready-made herbs from stores, Ralph's meager resources wouldn't be enough. He had no choice but to follow Professor Sprout's example and build his own greenhouse to cultivate herbs. Where will you plant them? Hermione glanced at him suspiciously. She had been curious about this question for a long time. Surely not in his precious little leather trunk? Ralph didn't answer, but looked at the round-faced boy and asked, what's wrong, Neville? Neville hesitated, then stammered, Ralph, can you give me some seeds? What do you need seeds for? Hermione asked in surprise. Neville blushed slightly, stammering for a moment before finally scratching his head and saying, I really like those magical plants, and I just want to plant them in my own yard so I can see them every day. Of course, Ralph patted Neville on the shoulder, encouraging him, if you like herbs, plant them. It's good to have an interest. But the seeds don't last long, and you don't have anywhere to plant them right now. When you come home for Christmas, I'll have an owl deliver them to you. That's great, Neville said gratefully. So, Neville doesn't have anywhere to plant them, but you do. Hermione leaned closer to Ralph, staring into his eyes, and said, you still haven't answered my question. Ralph smiled, mysteriously saying, you'll find out later, HMPH, fine, don't tell me then, I don't want to hear it anyway. As she walked up the steps of the Great Hall, Hermione stomped her feet a few times and glared at Ralph, a habitual little glare with no real power. "I'm going to find Shirley. I'm never talking to you two again." She waved her arms like a big white goose, flapping her wings, and ran up the stairs in a few steps, quickly disappearing from sight. Ralph sighed. That little vixen. Chapter 31 The Dark Lord's original scarf. The pitcher plant suddenly became a sensation at Hogwarts. Previously, everyone only used it as a self-service beverage dispenser or a natural toilet, but who knew it could have such a new use? The scene of Ron being choked by pitcher plants was widely circulated among the students, and Ron himself played a part in fueling the hype. Whenever a student asked about what happened in her biology class, Ron would vividly describe it, giving it 5-star reviews like strong trapping power, great suction, and self-lubricating effect. Ron was thrilled. Since arriving at Hogwarts, wherever he went, everyone's attention was focused on Harry. This was the first time he had received so much attention. But pitcher plant seeds weren't easy to obtain, so the Hogwarts black market was flooded with counterfeits. Better ones used mimosa and Venus flytraps as substitutes, while others used roadside foxtail grass to fool young wizards. Some even sold miniature pitcher plants, supposedly customizable in size and with a silky feel, but these were actually just rats that had been transformed with a transfiguration charm and then fixed in shape with a fixing potion, turning back into rats after a few days. It's utterly heartless. As the number of times they were scammed increased, many first-year wizards gradually realized that the most untrustworthy people were the gentle, kind, and witty upperclassmen. It's the same trick as those upperclassmen in their past lives who tried to sell them phone cards and English newspapers as soon as they entered school. On Thursday morning, Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw welcomed their first Defense Against the Dark Arts class, the most anticipated lesson for the young wizards. When Ralph and Neville arrived at the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, they almost thought they were in the wrong place. It didn't look like a classroom at all, more like a haunted house. The windows were covered by curtains, and dim torches flickered on the walls. The room reeked of garlic, extremely pungent and acrid. Due to the lack of sunlight, it was very damp, and the humidity intensified the garlic smell. Sherry always sat in the front row, wearing a long blue robe, her neat ponytail draped over her shoulder and hanging in front. Seeing her beckon, Ralph and Neville went over and sat down beside her. Neville covered his nose and asked, "Why aren't the windows open?" "They're all boarded up," Shirley said softly, turning to look at the window. "The curtains are sewn up too. There's no way to open them." Ralph, however, remained calm. He sat down, pulled out Professor McGonagall's old textbook, and continued studying his notes. He knew Quirrell's background. This year's Defense Against the Dark Arts course wouldn't teach much. Well, for the next 7 years, a Defense Against the Dark Arts course that taught anything would be heresy. Since that was the case, he might as well cherish his time and do something he loved. McGonagall's transfiguration talent only had a 1-month time limit, and Ralph wanted to use that time to self-study the first-year transfiguration course. But the other young wizards weren't so calm. The irritable Justin picked up a stool, intending to smash the board nailed to the window. "Don't smash it, don't open the window." Quirrell jumped out from the corner. He seemed to have been standing there for a while, but no one had noticed. He stammered, waving his arms to stop him. "I was injured by a vampire. I can't be exposed to wind or light." Hearing this, Justin quickly dropped his chair and backed away, seemingly afraid that Quirrell would turn into a vampire and bite him. "It's all right. I've treated my wound. I won't turn into a vampire. Don't worry, everyone, that female vampire didn't bite me." "Professor Quirrell, tell us your story of fighting the female vampire." Macmillan eagerly raised his hand. "Yes, that female vampire. Wasn't she beautiful?" The young wizards were initially frightened, but upon hearing that it was a female vampire, they instantly perked up. "Beautiful." Quirrell's face flushed crimson, and he stammered, "I met her at a wizard's inn in Romania. She was a bar singer. Her name was Elena. She was so beautiful, and then, Elena knocked on my door that night, saying she wanted to put on a great show for me, and then, she opened a bottle of red wine, to set the mood. I drank it. I got drunk. She carried me to bed." The young wizards all perked up their ears, and the girls shyly covered their ears, but still secretly left a slit open. "When I woke up again, I found my luggage was gone. My passport was gone. And my kidney had been removed." What a redemption story for a kidney harvester. The young wizards were somewhat disappointed. This wasn't the story they wanted to hear. Professor Quirrell quickly said, "I've never fought a vampire, but I did help an African chief, and banished a resurrected zombie." Quirrell pointed to the thick scarf wrapped around his head, his voice trembling. "This is a gift from that African chief, a present from the African land." But the sharp-eyed Hannah noticed a printed word on the scarf, "Fabriqué en France," made in France. Well, France is a major African country, so saying it came from Africa was quite reasonable. "Professor, why do you smell so much like garlic?" Justin sniffed. Quirrell pulled the scarf tighter, his lips pale, his teeth chattering. "That's not garlic, it's perilla. I lost a kidney. I use it to soothe my wounds." "Alright, let's begin the lesson." Professor Quirrell spoke haltingly, with a strange accent, and his teaching method was simple. He would read the Defense Against the Dark Arts textbook with utter emotion. We'll learn our first spell. Abandon charm. Everyone, repeat after me 3 times. Abandon, to discard, to give up. A few scattered reading voices filled the classroom. The young wizards never expected that Defense Against the Dark Arts was a reading class. Then, I could be a professor too. When the young wizards asked Quirrell to cast the spell, he raised his right hand, saying he had injured his arm fighting a dragon. This apparent injury drew utter disdain from everyone, their gazes towards Quirrell growing increasingly contemptuous, as if he could only be a professor because of connections. Later, Quirrell simply refused to read himself, letting the students recite on their own. He even drew a line, saying they would have to memorize the spell in the next class. "Professor Quirrell, long time no see." While the young wizards were reading, Ralph waved and greeted them quietly. "Ah, Ralph, what are you doing here?" Quirrell was startled. He seemed to have only just noticed Ralph today, even though the boy sat in the front row, and even though the boy had caused such a commotion at the sorting ceremony a few days ago. Quirrell hesitated for a moment, then said, "I remember you. Weren't you going to Alvermorny School of Witchcraft and Wizardry?" "I don't want to go anymore." Ralph looked at Quirrell, who was dressed like an Arab, and said with a simple expression, "You said you were coming to Hogwarts to work, and I figured if such an excellent wizard like you came, I might as well study here too." The blonde boy chuckled, "I don't need to go to Alvermorny." When Ralph and Knit went to Albania to investigate, they encountered Quirrell. The boy, hearing that the other was called Quirrell, deliberately chatted with him for a long time. At that time, Quirrell wasn't like he is now. He wasn't wearing a headscarf, his behavior was normal, and he hadn't encountered Voldemort. "Professor, I remember you said you were going to find the mystic, and that you would capture him and send him to Azkaban. Did you catch him?" Ralph lowered his voice. Quirrell's face paled slightly, and he shook his head. "I didn't." Quirrell wanted to say, "He didn't say that," but Ralph interrupted, "Didn't find him? That's a real shame. These students don't understand your power and speak ill of you, but I understand all too well." The boy looked at Quirrell with admiration. Quirrell wiped the sweat from his forehead, weak and feeble, forcing a smile. But the boy's next words terrified him. "I still remember your bold words back then, calling the mysterious man a son of a bitch, a beast, a bastard, and saying that if you found the mysterious man, you would kill him on the spot." Quirrell's face was bloodless, his eyes were lifeless, and he was drenched in sweat. He quickly waved his hands and said, I didn't. "Don't talk nonsense." Ralph grabbed Quirrell's hand and said enthusiastically, "Professor, show everyone your outstanding magic, don't be stingy." Just then, Ralph's brain suddenly dinged. One domestic slave, Quirinus Quirrell, detected, triggering side quest 1, helped Quirrell remove his thick scarf, allowing his rotting head to fully enjoy the warmth of the sun. Reward, the Dark Lord's original scarf. 1 parasitic Voldemort detected, triggering side quest 2, help Voldemort leave Quirrell's body. Reward, magic, Shapeshifter, ability to invade the consciousness and mind of magical creatures and control their behavior. Chapter 32, The Peak Breeds False Support, Twilight Witnesses True Servants. A reading activity that lasted for most of the class ended just like that. The young wizards were greatly disappointed. This Defense Against the Dark Arts class was completely meaningless and a waste of time. Even a dog would be better than Quirrell, at least it wouldn't stutter. Quirrell was even more miserable than the students. Under Ralph's torment, he didn't know how he even made it to the end of get out of class. On his way to the office, his eyes were blurry and his legs were trembling. Scamander, that chatterbox, had kept him chatting throughout the class, talking about his trip to Albania, about those days of how Quirrell creatively insulted the Dark Lord. Quirrell had indeed insulted him. He admitted it. At that time, he hadn't yet entered the Albanian forest, much less met the Dark Lord, but he had encountered the famous Mr. Scamander and his grandson, Ralph. Ralph kept pestering him, wanting to hear stories of the African savannah, and looked at him with adoration. Quirrell was a little tipsy, and after drinking some of the wine Ralph had brought, he started pontificating and lightly insulting the Dark Lord. If things had ended there, it would have been fine, but then he entered the Albanian forest and actually encountered the Dark Lord. At that point, there was still room for maneuver, since it had all been a long time, but then this kid who was going to Hermione came to Hogwarts and forcibly triggered a wave of flashbacks for him. Ralph Scamander, do you know you have an autistic grandfather who talks so much? Quirrell really couldn't imagine what kind of interesting expression the Dark Lord would have if he heard those words from behind. He certainly wanted to die. He used to get drunk after just a sip of alcohol, so why wasn't he drunk that night, and why did he ramble on like that? Drinking really makes things worse. Quirrell's head was spinning as he walked alone toward the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. Students pointed and whispered at him in the corridor, but he paid them no heed. Quirrell stumbled into the office, his body trembling as he opened the door, closed it, and locked it. Quirrell stood before a mirror, slowly untying the thick scarf around his head, revealing a bald head. On the back of his head was a face, as white as chalk, with closed eyes and two long, thin nostrils like snakes. After removing the scarf, Quirrell began to remove his large robes. He stripped naked and knelt in the center of the office. His body was so thin that his ribs were clearly visible, and his back was shockingly scarred. Quirrell raised his wand, and one end conjured a long, thin whip studded with sharp metal barbs. Quirrell picked up the whip, gritted his teeth, and lashed his back with all his might. The skin, which had almost healed, was once again covered in blood. He lashed out again and again, letting out screams of agony, pleading, "Master, forgive my ignorance, forgive my past offenses. Back then, I was just a lost wizard in the mortal world. You gave me my goal, my direction. I am guilty, I repent, I beg you to show me mercy." Quirrell whipped himself harder, but the back of his head remained closed, his eyes never opening, enduring the lashes. The entire office echoed with the sound of whipping, Quirrell's weeping, and his prayers. After a long while, the familiar voice finally rang out, "Very well, of course I forgive you, my most loyal servant." The voice was icy and chilling. Yet it sounded like heavenly music to Quirrell's ears. He caught his breath, then collapsed to the ground, weeping bitterly, murmuring, "Thank you, Master, thank you for your mercy." Voldemort narrowed his blood-red eyes. If it were before, he would have simply bestowed an Avada Kedavra upon him. A servant dared to insult him? It was an insult to the heavens. But the Dark Lord had no one else to rely on besides Quirrell. He didn't want to return to the deep forest, to spend another 10 years in the shadows. He had no choice but to forgive. "Scamander saw you in Albania?" Voldemort asked. "Yes, Master. I didn't expect him to come to Hogwarts." "Should we kill him?" Quirrell asked. "Fool. You think he won't find out you killed someone right under Dumbledore's nose?" Voldemort shrieked. "Your trespassing into Gringotts' vault is enough to make him wary. If you kill someone again, you'll have no chance to steal the Philosopher's Stone. Then what should we do?" "We should indeed make plans sooner rather than later." Voldemort narrowed his eyes, his face grim. "If Dumbledore knows you went to Albania and you didn't mention it to him, he'll definitely suspect you. My power is still too weak. You alone are not enough to handle the current situation." Voldemort's eyes flashed with murderous intent as he whispered, "I must summon my other servant." Quirrell knelt on the ground, trembling violently. "Is it Snape? He used to be your servant, right here at Hogwarts." "No." Voldemort's unpredictable face revealed a mocking expression. He sneered, "The night I lost my power, Snape betrayed Dumbledore and became a professor at Hogwarts, living a peaceful life for 10 years without ever seeking his master again. The peak breeds false support, twilight reveals true servants. I can't believe he's still one of my men." "Then who will you ask for help?" Voldemort whispered in Quirrell's ear, and Quirrell trembled with excitement. "With that guy, we'll definitely succeed." "Master, do you really think so?" Voldemort asked. "Yes, Master." Voldemort's expression hardened, his eyes revealing the cruelty of his cold nature. He roared, "You'd better throw that thought into the Albanian forest. Have you forgotten Gringotts' failure? Let me tell you, if you think you can make another mistake and I can let you stay here comfortably as a professor, then you're mistaken. Master, I won't let you down again." Quirrell sobbed, looking like a wronged little wife. Don't show that disgusting face. I'm scolding you today for your own good. I'm scolding you because I see you still have some use. Voldemort's tone grew increasingly sharp. Just wait until I stop losing my temper, then you'll see, Quirrell simply kowtowed. How are the herbs? I've brought a lot of badgers into the Forbidden Forest. I'll be able to steal herbs soon, and then the Philosopher's Stone, and I can brew the potion to revive you, Quirrell said, his face full of fear. And unicorn blood, Voldemort narrowed his eyes. I need to regain some strength. Go to the Forbidden Forest and catch a few. Yes, Master. Voldemort closed his eyes and fell asleep again. In this state, he couldn't do much, only sense what was happening outside. Quirrell struggled to his feet. He walked to a small basin of white sap and gently wiped the blood from his back, observing how the blood swirled in the water. After a moment, he looked at the mirrors, one in front of the other, allowing him to clearly see the Dark Lord's tightly closed face. That terrifying, noseless face stirred a wanton impulse within Quirrell. This blasphemous thought sent a chill down his spine. He picked up his belt and plunged the sharp metal barbs into his flesh. Pain suppressed his desire. As the barbs pierced deeper, Quirrell's muscles contracted instinctively. He slowly exhaled, savoring the satisfaction that came with the pain. After drying his wounds, the man put his robe back on, wrapped the scarf around his head, and reverted to the timid, stuttering Quirrell he once was. Thanks to the generous donor book friend 20220714210653410 inches for the donation. Chapter 33 Silverfish. The Dark Lord's original scarf. On his way to the library, Ralph was still pondering this slightly risque, limited edition phrase. The focus wasn't on the scarf, nor on its original quality, but on the Dark Lord. Anything from the Dark Lord was bound to be of high quality, since it was Voldemort's scarf. It couldn't be ordinary. Ralph glanced at the system description. It was a magical item that could conceal one's presence, effectively blocking the detection of wizards. Like a spyglass, a dark magic detector would glow and rotate if a suspicious person appeared nearby, but the magic on the scarf could perfectly conceal it, preventing the spyglass from triggering. This was an item that could be combined with the disappearance charm or the invisibility cloak. After all, many wizards could see through the invisibility cloak and the disappearance charm, and the scarf's barrier would effectively reduce the possibility of being discovered. No wonder the Dark Lord had been hiding on Quirrell's back of the head, and so many excellent wizards at Hogwarts hadn't noticed. It was because of the scarf. Indeed, the most powerful treasures often only require the simplest form. Ralph really wanted the scarf, especially the Dark Lord's original one. Using it would definitely be very exciting. However, according to the mission requirements, Quirrell needed to untie his scarf to let him feel the warmth of the sun, which was a difficult task. Quirrell was destined not to untie his scarf casually, so unconventional methods would have to be used, and unconventional methods might provoke the Dark Lord. Even the most skilled snake manipulator could risk being bitten while teasing a venomous snake. Fortunately, Voldemort was currently at his most vulnerable and easily bullied stage. His target was the Philosopher's Stone, and he wouldn't easily expose himself. In the original timeline, the Weasley twins had chased Quirrell around with snowballs, hitting him on the back of the head. A snake fallen into a trap is easily bullied by a lion. That's a perfect example. This guy is capable. Compared to the Dark Lord's original scarf, Ralph was also very interested in the Gropster spell. After class, he plunged into the library. Hogwarts Library, located on the second floor of the castle, although not large in area, housed a vast collection of books, including many rare and unique ancient texts not found elsewhere. These treasures mostly came from Ravenclaw's private collection, which she donated after the school was built, and were also the library's original holdings. This includes Sumerian astrology, Assyrian clay tablet witchcraft, and necromancy handwritten on papyrus by the ancient Egyptian priest Manetho. The Hogwarts Library is also a symbol of Hogwarts' dissemination of knowledge and wisdom. Entering such a place, you can't help but hold your breath, afraid to whisper or cause trouble. Of course, Mrs. Pants, the librarian, is also an important reason for the young wizard's quietness. She is a grumpy, thin woman, much like a malnourished vulture, and with a duster in her hand, she looks even more dangerous. Ralph glanced at her a few times and noticed that the duster she used to clean the dust was not made of chicken feathers, but of unicorn hair. This kind of duster can clean dust, remove scribbles from books, and even has a warding effect on those restless books that try to attack. Hogwarts is full of treasures. Any inconspicuous little gadget may be a magical item of good quality, it just depends on whether you have an eye for beauty. As a first-year student, to enter the library, one must thoroughly study the library guide, refrain from making noise, fighting, or secretly taking books. There are many rules, a full 108, and violating any one of them will result in a deduction of house points. In serious cases, one might be blacklisted and permanently banned from the library. On the permanently banned list nailed to the wall, Ralph surprisingly found a student named Carol Scamander, who had once brought a dragon in and nearly burned down the library, resulting in a lifetime ban. Well, Ralph had seen this name in the family tree. By lineage, he was his great-uncle. Later, this guy was also expelled from Hufflepuff. No wonder Mrs. Pants had been watching Ralph closely after learning his surname. The boy had thought he was a Newt Fangirl like Professor Sprout. Luckily, he hadn't tried to get close, or he would have been asking for trouble. Once inside the library, Ralph quickly found a magic dictionary on a bookshelf and searched for the entry for Shapeshifter. Shapeshifter is a type of magic that allows a wizard to invade the consciousness of an animal and control its behavior. In effect, it's similar to animagus magic, both allowing the wizard to move around from the animal's perspective. However, animagus magic involves transformation, where the wizard becomes the animal, while Shapeshifter magic involves the wizard's consciousness entering and controlling the animal's body. The magical mechanisms are vastly different. Compared to animagus magic, which only allows the wizard to transform into one type of animal, Shapeshifter magic can invade more animals, making it much harder to defend against. However, Shapeshifter magic also has significant drawbacks. If the wizard's consciousness cannot overcome the animals, it will have adverse effects on the wizard. If the animal is killed while Shapeshifter is invading the animal's consciousness, it will cause extremely serious damage to the wizard's psyche, potentially leading to brain death. Ralph's talent for shapeshifting is mediocre. He feels he might have difficulty learning animagus magic, but Shapeshifter magic is quite suitable for him. Of course, this is contingent on completing the system's tasks. The boy was engrossed in flipping through a dictionary when he noticed an image of a magical creature next to some text. The creature had fine silver-gray scales and 9 barbels at the end of its abdomen, resembling a fish. Ralph frowned. He reached out and touched it, and suddenly the image seemed to come alive, darting swiftly through the gaps between the lines of text, eventually emerging from the book. The literal image wasn't a picture, but a living magical creature. A sudden ding sounded in Ralph's mind, detected one domesticated silverfish. Side quest triggered, capture a silverfish. Reward, magic, word devourer, can consume text from books and convert it into memories, storing them in the brain. Ralph had heard Newt mention silverfish before. They were extremely rare magical creatures, surviving in a way similar to salamanders. Salamanders could only live in flames, while silverfish could only live in books, feeding on the magic within the text and swallowing it whole. Ralph hurriedly gave chase, but the bookworm was incredibly fast. It darted away, dashing across the bookshelves and weaving through the books. As if afraid Ralph couldn't keep up, it stopped every so often, glanced back at the boy, and flicked its tail at him, utterly arrogant and provocative. Ralph pursued it until the bookworm swaggered into the restricted section. Just as Ralph was about to step in, he heard a cold voice behind him. "What are you looking for, child?" "Nothing, just browsing." Ralph withdrew his foot, looking honestly at Mrs. Pins, who was carrying a unicorn feather duster. But this honest facade didn't work on Mrs. Pins, especially since the man before her was a Scamander. The surname alone was enough to make her wary. "Do you know that's the restricted area?" Pinsfield frowned, lightly waving his duster and pointing to a rope on the ground. "You can't cross it without permission." "I didn't know, madam," Ralph quickly apologized. "I didn't mean to. It's my first day at the library." "Then hurry up and leave. If you go near the restricted area again, I'll kick you out of the library." Mrs. Pinsfield, the librarian, waved her duster and chased Ralph away. The boy sighed. He turned his head and saw the bookworm perched on a thick book in the restricted area, basking in the sun and even rolling around, looking quite content. The bookworm met his gaze, its silver eyes filled with intense mockery. It wagged its tail, as if to say, "Come and catch me." Ralph was furious. "You wait, when I catch you, I'll stuff you into the Dark Lord's original scarf, then into Snape's patinated underwear, and marinate you." Chapter 34. A life without nighttime strolls is incomplete. Ralph circled the library, hoping to sneak into the restricted area and catch that wretched silverfish. Unfortunately, wherever he went, Mrs. Pants's gaze was fixed on him, forcing the boy to strategically give up. Ralph headed towards the study area, where tables were set up and many students were studying. Most were Ravenclaw's hounds. As a house renowned for its intelligence, the most direct way to demonstrate intelligence was through academic performance. Although this understanding was somewhat biased, a top-down, competitive atmosphere had developed in hounds, with everyone coming to the library to study every day. Hufflepuffs were the vanguard against this competition. Leisure and relaxation were their daily routine. When the hounds had free time, they mostly didn't come to the library, but instead enjoyed afternoon tea in the common room, savoring treats made by house elves. The industrious, tireless, and busy house elves cured their mental exhaustion. Gryffindor students weren't many either. They were busy adventuring throughout the castle. As for Slytherin House, they firmly believed that social skills are better than academic prowess. Building connections was the primary task, while academics were merely a secondary skill. After all, many who didn't perform well academically would have to return home to inherit the manor and family business. Ralph quickly found Sherry and Hermione in a corner. The two girls were studying. One had a slight frown, the other was biting a quill, both looking extremely focused and hard-working. Sherry was working on the assignment Professor McGonagall had given her. Ralph glanced at it. Well, she was a tiny bit faster than him. As for Hermione, as soon as Ralph leaned closer, she covered the parchment with both hands, her face flushed, and said, "Don't look," but Ralph had already seen quite a bit of it. He lowered his voice and read, "Dear Professor Dumbledore, I am an ordinary first-year student at Gryffindor House. I want to complain." Hermione quickly leaned on the desk, her chin on the parchment, and shouted, "Don't read." "Don't read." Ralph sat in his chair, looking at her strangely, and said, "Hermione, you're not writing a letter to the headmaster, preparing to complain about Professor Quirrell, are you?" Hearing this, even Sherry glanced at her curiously. Hermione blinked, her face red, and huffed, "Is that not allowed? I'm thinking about everyone's studies. What can you learn in a defense against the dark arts class like this? Then you might have to write a lot of letters." "Why?" The girl looked up at Ralph, her brows furrowing slightly, and said, "You mean, Professor Dumbledore won't take this matter seriously just because it's a complaint letter?" "No, I mean," Ralph grinned, "you're probably going to complain about a lot of professors soon. Half the Hogwarts faculty are unqualified. You can't even tolerate Professor Quirrell after just one encounter." Sherry tapped her fingers lightly on the table, her movements gentle. She whispered a reminder, "Mrs. Pants is watching us." Ralph and Hermione immediately shut up. After a while, the witch's gaze shifted, and Ralph explained in a whispered voice, "I was trying to go into the Forbidden Zone, but Mrs. Pants caught me. She's watching me now, ready to cause me trouble." "What were you doing in the Forbidden Zone?" Sherry asked curiously. "I found a silverfish," Ralph replied. Both girls looked confused, which was normal. Even Newt's Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them didn't mention this obscure magical creature. Silverfish were incredibly rare, even someone as knowledgeable as Newt had only ever seen one in his life. It's a magical creature that can swim between the lines of text, feeding on the magic contained within the words, Ralph explained. They can absorb words, and of course, they can also spit them out. It's no exaggeration to say that a silverfish is a walking library. Really? You caught one? Hermione was very excited. She was quite interested in these magical creatures. If she caught a silverfish, she wouldn't need to come to the library anymore. She could just have it spit out the contents of any book she wanted to read. The silverfish escaped to the forbidden section, and I was just about to go in when Mrs. Pants appeared. Ralph sighed. I have to think of a way to catch it in the forbidden section. To enter the forbidden section, you need a professor's signed approval. Hermione had already found out. It's useless. The teachers won't write an approval for a little wizard who's only been in school for less than a week. Ralph shook his head. Sherry hesitated for a moment, then said, Ralph, if you really want to go to the Forbidden Zone, I can help you. Professor McGonagall. Yes, Sherry nodded slightly. I said I wanted to borrow a few Transfiguration books from the Forbidden Library. Professor McGonagall should agree. No. Ralph straightened his posture and said seriously, that bookworm is very cunning. Catching it will probably make quite a commotion. If Professor McGonagall finds out you lied to her, it will affect her impression of you. It's not worth it. Ralph tilted his head, thought for a moment, and squinted his eyes. Let's go at night. I'll sneak into the forbidden zone in the middle of the night. How can you go at night? If you get caught, you'll lose house points, Hermione objected. No. Absolutely not, Ralph ignored the innocent and naive girl. Don't be fooled by Hermione's current behavior, always talking about school rules and the house. That's because she hasn't yet experienced the allure of breaking the rules. Once she's experienced it the first time, she'll get hooked and become more eager than anyone else every day. Seeing Hermione still wouldn't give up, Ralph smiled and said, "Your objection is invalid. I'm the one who goes out at night, not you. If anyone's going to be penalized, it'll be Hufflepuff's house points. Besides, not going out at night at Hogwarts is like not skipping classes, not failing courses, and not having a relationship. It's an incomplete school life." Nonsense. Hermione rolled her eyes, turned her head away, and sneered, "Sherry and I don't go out at night, skip classes, fail courses, and, well, you know." "Right, Sherry." Sherry smiled, her eyes curving into crescent moons. Just then, two withered arms reached out and forcefully pressed Hermione and Sherry's heads down, then grabbed Ralph's ears. Finally, Mrs. Pants grabbed the three of them by the clothes, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she dragged them out of the library amidst the awe-inspiring gazes of the young wizards. Standing at the library entrance, Hermione looked aggrieved. "Oh no," she said with a pained expression, "I'm definitely going to be under close scrutiny every time I come to the library. A life without being kicked out of the library isn't complete." Ralph offered a completely insincere consolation. Hermione puffed out her cheeks in anger, her eyes darting around before she suddenly asked, "When are you planning your nighttime stroll?" Sherry also looked up at him. Ralph said warily, "What? Are you going to write to Professor Dumbledore to report me too?" "Hermione, don't go too far," Hermione retorted irritably. "Report you my foot, in a few days, after I've gotten more familiar with Hogwarts," Ralph said with a smile, his hands tucked into his sleeves. "Want to come along? Who wants to come with you?" "You'll get caught," Hermione snorted coldly, grabbing Sherry's hand and leaving. From afar, Hermione looked like a cheerful white goose, while Sherry's ponytail swayed gently, like a country girl's flower branch swaying in the breeze. Ralph stood watching the two girls' retreating figures until they disappeared from sight. Then he walked to the window, rested his chin on his hands, and gazed into the distance. According to the Minotaur system's preferences, that silverfish certainly had an owner. But when Newt was still studying at Hogwarts, he had seen a silverfish in the library. Back then, it had 8 barbels at the end of its abdomen. A silverfish only grows 1 barbel every 100 years. In other words, the silverfish Ralph saw was probably the same one Newt saw back then, and it was now over 900 years old. A silverfish that had lived in the Hogwarts library for over 900 years, who could its owner be? Thanks to Give Me a Bottle of Wine and a Cigarette and Binksu for their generous donations. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35 Death. Hermione wrote a complaint letter 2 feet long on parchment, but didn't send it to Dumbledore immediately. She had also written a letter of criticism and advice, which she secretly slipped under the door of the Defense Against the Dark Arts office when no one was looking. Hermione believed her letter was well-reasoned, forceful, and measured enough to touch Quirrell's soul. He should change soon enough, or at the very least, resign voluntarily to save face. But if he remained stubbornly unyielding, obstinate and insisted on his teaching style, Hermione would use her most forceful method, dropping the complaint letter into the headmaster's mailbox. Even more cruelly and coldly, 2 letters. Whether it would touch Quirrell's soul, Ralph wasn't sure, but Professor Binns' soul definitely needed to be touched. After all, even if Quirrell was terrible, he was only going to teach him for a year, and would be buried next year. He could grit his teeth and bear it, but everyone had to put up with Professor Binns for 7 years. As the only ghost professor, Professor Binns was an absolute role model of dedication. Even as a ghost, he continued teaching, refusing pay, bonuses, and teaching assistants, working year-round without a break. Those on the school board, who disliked Professor Binns' history of magic during their student days and desperately wanted to replace him, immediately grew fond of this old ghost after becoming board members themselves. This is probably what they mean by ignorant when they criticize Binns, mature when they admire him, and when it comes to payday, They want everyone to be Binns. The annual Hogwarts Outstanding Professor Award is also given to Professor Binns, a monopoly he has held for centuries, creating an unbreakable record. Even the usually sarcastic Snape couldn't find fault with him. But the good employee in the eyes of the board members wasn't the good teacher in the eyes of the students. As a ghost who had existed for so long, Professor Binns certainly possessed a wealth of historical knowledge, but as a ghost, he couldn't access new books on the history of magic, much less read their contents. He also didn't want to learn about the history that had been rewritten with major archaeological discoveries. Professor Binns was like a stagnant pool, lifeless and devoid of any vitality. Even the master of ceremonies at funerals was more passionate than him. The Dementors of Azkaban were more energetic when kissing prisoners. In the Fertile Crescent, in Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, wizards gathered and established early nations. Eridu, Kish, Lagash, Uruk, Ur, and Nippur. In their first History of Magic class, the young Hufflepuff and Gryffindor wizards listened to Professor Binns's deep, monotonous voice as if it were the hum of an old, worn-out vacuum cleaner. To compete for the Muggle population, the wizarding kingdoms often waged war, causing Mediterranean tsunamis and massive floods that submerged the land, leading to the destruction of the wizarding kingdoms. Wizards scattered across the lands began serving as priests and temple staff for the Muggles, protecting them from magical creatures, and the transmission of magic passed down through the Temple of Jakarta. Professor Binns recounted the early history of the Wizarding Kingdom's founding and destruction, and read aloud the Epic of Gilgamesh in a completely emotionless tone. This was a hymn of praise from the Sumerian Muggles to the powerful wizard Gilgamesh. Only 3 minutes into the class, Neville, who was determined to study hard, had already fallen asleep on his desk. Without Raffer holding him, his sleep was somewhat restless. Hannah yawned repeatedly, reaching up to grab her 2 pigtails and pulling them up, trying to wake herself, but ultimately wobbled and collapsed onto the desk, falling fast asleep. Burns, cheeks bulging from secretly eating cake, finally succumbed to Professor Binns's hypnotic influence halfway through, burying his face in the food and getting cream all over his body. 10 minutes into the lesson, a quarter of the Hufflepuff and Gryffindor students were already asleep. 20 minutes in, half were asleep, and the other half had just woken up. It was break time. Hermione was probably the only student awake, but to keep herself alert, she stood there writing notes and even did a few chest-expanding exercises. Gilgamesh, heartbroken by the death of his dearest friend, held Enkidu's body and wept for 7 days and 7 nights, only letting go when the corpse began to decompose. Professor Binns seemed oblivious to the student's sleepiness, still engrossed in reading the epic, his voice flat and monotonous. Gilgamesh, knowing the terror of death, began searching for death in order to achieve immortality. He traversed Mount Marsh, the abyss of darkness, and the sea of death. Ralph, who had just woken up and finished doing chest-expanding exercises with Hermione, raised his hand and asked, "Professor Binns, is there really a death?" Professor Binns, interrupted from his lecture, looked up in surprise. He stared at Ralph and said slowly, "My name is Ralph Scamander, and I'm a student at Hufflepuff House." "Professor, you just said Gilgamesh was searching for death. Is there really a death?" Professor Binns frowned. He didn't like students asking questions, so he said coldly, "Of course not. It's a complete fabrication, something Muggles made up to comfort themselves. Powerful wizards of antiquity were considered gods by Muggles, thus giving rise to many myths, but that doesn't mean these myths are true." Like death, a quarter of the students were awake because the classroom was filled with normal human voices, making them think get out of class had ended. Neville stood up dazedly and headed towards the door, only to realize that get out of class wasn't over yet. His face flushed, he hurriedly sat back down. "Professor, you just said that powerful wizards are gods in the eyes of Muggles, which has given rise to many stories." Ralph pondered for a moment and asked, "Following your line of thought, could it also be argued that there are even more powerful beings who are gods in the eyes of wizards, thus also giving rise to many wizarding stories?" The boy paused, then continued, "Like the Grim Reaper in the Three Brothers story." Professor Binns was speechless for a long time before stammering, "I have never seen any evidence in the real world to suggest that the Three Brothers story is more than just a legend. The invincible wand, the resurrection stone, the invisibility cloak. There are indeed invisibility cloaks, but they are all made using the disillusionment charm or cloaks woven from the fur of invisible beasts. They will become real after a while and are not permanent." Ralph was somewhat disappointed. He had thought that Professor Binns, who was well versed in the history of magic and had survived as a ghost for so many years, would have some remarkable insights. But he seemed to be completely unaware of the concept of the Deathly Hallows. Professor, if I may be so bold, doesn't the existence of ghosts prove that wizards don't completely disappear after death? Life and death aren't mutually exclusive concepts, and death isn't the end of life. Nonsense, Scatty, Professor Binns finally snapped. I only study real history, not stories and legends. Slytherin, deduct 2 points. Hermione, seeing Ralph being reprimanded, her little face and delicate eyebrows furrowed. She craned her neck, raising her hand defiantly. Professor, if you don't discuss stories and legends, why do you read the Epic of Gilgamesh? Isn't that a story? Professor Binns was furious. He scolded, Miss Penny Fates, talking back to teacher, deduct 2 points from Slytherin. All the students snapped out of their daze, staring at this inexplicable argument. They didn't know the cause and effect, they only saw Professor Binns reprimanding the Hufflepuff and Gryffindor students, and then deducting 2 points from Slytherin. 2 students in a row made the same mistake, the odds are too high. Doesn't it mean? This gave the little lions endless inspiration. In an instant, all the Gryffindor students were wide awake. They raised their hands, vying to ask questions. Professor, I have an immature idea about life and death. Professor, can you tell me how to become a ghost? Professor, I am Draco Malfoy of Slytherin. Thanks to Sane for the generous donation. Thanks to April, and for their donations. Thanks to the first generous donor, I owe +10 chapters. In this new era, the editor doesn't recommend large updates, so I'll add more chapters when it's published. I can manage for now, thank you all. Chapter 36 Magic Potions and Spicy Hot Pot. The quiet history of magic classroom erupted in a cacophony of questions, the lively scene resembling a fan meeting. Professor Binns, not to mention Professor McGonagall who happened to be passing by, was bewildered. She had taken history of magic herself, and had been half asleep and half awake, so she had no idea what the course was all about. But hearing the unusual laughter and chatter coming from the classroom almost made her think that these young wizards had finally sent the ghostly Professor Binns away. Otherwise, why would they be so happy? Indeed, as the young wizards suspected, Professor Binns was getting senile, unable to distinguish students' names and houses, always getting them mixed up. But he also seemed to be quite senile, because he always managed to shout with precision and force, Slytherin, deduct 2 points. It seemed to be all Slytherin's fault. What deep-seated hatred, what deep-seated resentment. It wasn't that he hadn't accidentally harmed the other 3 houses, but when Slytherin's points deducted were far ahead, only Slytherin was hurt. After a class, under the relentless onslaught of the Gryffindor wizards, Slytherin lost a whopping 150 points. At the end of Get Out of Class, everyone was buzzing about this little trick for racking up points, and many students were eagerly anticipating the history of magic. Ralph became even more famous, even the portraits in Hogwarts Castle had heard of him and wanted to meet this little wizard who caused such a stir every day. The fat lady of Gryffindor even changed her password to Scamander, because she remembered a portrait of someone named Scamander, and the two had shared a wonderful night on a dragon. But this fame came at a terrible price. At lunch in the Great Hall, Professor Snape shifted his gaze from Harry's eyes to Ralph's. This school year was crucial for Slytherin. They were aiming for their 7th consecutive House Cup. 7 was a magical number. No house in Hogwarts history had ever dominated the House Cup for 7 consecutive years. Professor Snape wanted to challenge this record and add another piece to his already impressive resume. As 6-time House Cup champions, Slytherin are undoubtedly powerful, but their secret lies not in scoring, but in deducting points. Professor Snape is like a ruthless point deduction machine, dragging his robes around every day, relentlessly deducting points from other houses. In previous years, he would only ramp up his efforts after Christmas, but this year, to ensure no surprises, he started aggressively increasing points at the beginning of the semester. As long as all the other houses' points are deducted, Slytherin will naturally be number 1. It must be said that this strategy had an immediate effect. In just a few days, Slytherin firmly secured first place, widening the gap significantly between second place Ravenclaw and Slytherin. But now, a single History of Magic class has dropped Slytherin to 3rd, only slightly ahead of 4th place Gryffindor. How could Snape not be furious? As for why Gryffindor's score is so low? Of course, it's due to Professor Snape's precise strikes, especially Harry, who lost 50 points in the very first class. Ralph felt utterly innocent. The Deathly Hallows and the Peveril brothers are real, So he's very interested in the reality of death? Coincidentally, Professor Binns is talking about Gilgamesh's search for death, and Ralph wanted to have a friendly academic discussion, but little did he expect Professor Binns to deduct points, and even target Slytherin. Ralph didn't mean it, but as the instigator, he unintentionally started an era of massive point deductions for Slytherin. Adding to this the conflict caused by Malfoy at the beginning of the school year, given Snape's personality, he'll definitely settle old scores in potions class. During lunch in the Great Hall, many students came to comfort Ralph, seemingly having already pronounced his death sentence. Even Harry came over, using his own tragic experiences to comfort him, telling him to be strong and not give up hope. Harry was practically a living example, because he had been asked many questions by Snape in his first class. When Harry answered, he remembered Ron's advice not to look Snape in the eye, but was still accused of sleeping in class and lost 5 points. When Harry opened his eyes, Snape glared at the professor, seemingly trying to intimidate him, and he lost another 5 points. When Harry kept his eyes open and avoided eye contact with Professor Snape, he was accused of disrespecting the professor and giving him an ugly look, and lost yet another 5 points. When Harry accidentally broke a narrow-necked bottle containing potions, he was deducted 5 points for damaging public property. However, just 1 minute later, Malfoy broke a bottle and gained 5 points. The reason was that Malfoy helped Snape destroy the flawed vessel, preventing a teaching accident. Therefore, in the history of magic class, Harry was the student who asked the most questions, simply to retaliate for the hurt Snape had caused his young mind. On Friday afternoon, Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw welcomed potions class, which was held in a basement. The room was decorated in a gloomy style, the air thick with the smell of formaldehyde, like a morgue. Glass jars of all sizes lined the walls, containing lifelike animal specimens. Human skeletons hung on the walls, their lifeless eye sockets facing the students. When a young wizard approached, the skeletons would suddenly let out a cack laugh. In a corner lay a mummy, wrapped in strips of cloth, revealing a withered face with 2 patches of red cheeks and a deathly pale complexion. The inscription on it read, "Daily Necessities." "Professor, what's with that mummy?" Macmillan asked, trembling, as he raised his hand before class. Professor Snape, surprisingly, didn't get angry. Instead, he patiently explained, "This was a defense against the dark arts professor from a few years ago. He borrowed my room to brew a potion, but he went wrong with the steps, causing the potion to fail. After drinking it, he turned into a mummy." "Potions? Are they that dangerous?" "No, not that dangerous," Snape drawled, chuckling, "as long as you're not the kind of idiots I often encounter, you're quite safe." Many students swallowed hard. They clearly had a good understanding of their own intelligence. "Of course, even if you're idiots, I guarantee I won't turn you into mummies," Snape grinned. "But whether you end up in the school hospital isn't up to me, that depends on how much smarter you are than the trolls." The young wizards were silent. Ralph glanced at Neville beside him and noticed his lips were pale and his whole body was trembling. "Are you alright?" he asked silently. Neville just shook his head, but his trembling only intensified. Snape began to pick up the roster. When he called Neville's name, Neville, terrified, let out a long, trembling like a heroine stuck in a washing machine in a romantic movie. Snape stopped, his dark eyes fixed on Neville, and said coldly, "Mr. Longbottom, if you dare make that sound again, I'll." Neville was so nervous that he wanted to say yes, but the words trembled and turned into a seductive Professor Snape. Everyone held back their laughter, afraid of being turned into mummies by Professor Snape and hung on the wall as new everyday items, but they struggled to suppress it, their faces contorted. Snape, dragging his robes, slowly walked to Neville's side, staring intently at him. Then, the professor suddenly turned to Ralph and said, "Scamander, why didn't you stop Longbottom? Does seeing your classmate make you look good?" Hufflepuff, deduct 5 points. "What, you disagree?" Snape lowered his voice. "Yes, Ralph Scamander, grandson of the famous Mr. Newt Scamander. I hope you won't be expelled from Hogwarts like your grandfather." Snape displayed strong aggression from the outset. He waved his robes and strode back to the podium, his voice hoarse as he said, "You are here to learn the ancient, precise, and rigorous art of potion making. What is a potion? Broken entrails, congealed blood, entwined tentacles, twisted plants, withered limbs, mutilated brains, scarlet berries, tumbling in the contrast of red and white, settling in the fusion of yellow and brown. It is an eternal and beautiful art." Ralph licked his lips. For some reason, He suddenly remembered spicy hot pot and spicy broth. He was hungry. Chapter 37 I learned it with my dad in Hawaii. When Professor Snape pulled a large, robust porcupine from the shelf, Ralph felt even hungrier. Porcupine meat is tender, delicious, and rich in calcium, phosphorus, and other minerals, often called animal ginseng. Whether steamed, boiled, fried, or stewed, it's a rare and excellent ingredient. Scamander, how do you remove the porcupine's quills? Snape suddenly asked. The young wizards exchanged glances, instantly perking up. They had all heard about Harry Potter's brutal humiliation at Snape's last potions class. Scamander had also offended Snape, so trouble was inevitable. They just hadn't expected it to come so quickly. Ralph stood up, his expression calm, and said, "Heat the water to 85 degrees Celsius, and pour it over the porcupine's entire body against the direction of its quills until the quills can be easily pulled out without damaging the skin. After pulling out the thick and thin quills with magic tweezers, use lantern grass fibers to brush out the roots and down of the broken quills from front to back." Just read from the book, Snape snorted in dissatisfaction. He turned to look at the young wizards, who were standing there dumbfounded like idiots, and roared, "Hurry up and write this down. Do you all know it?" The classroom immediately filled with a sound of scribbling notes. Snape walked to the podium and lowered his voice. "Today, we are going to concoct a simple potion to treat boils. We need to be careful when brewing the potion. Incorrect preparation will cause the potion to cause boils instead of healing them. Therefore, you need to pay extra attention to the brewing steps, and don't let yourselves spend this weekend." Snape's thin lips twisted into a terrifying smile. At the school hospital, he waved his wand, and the previously blank blackboard appeared with many words: ingredients, dried nettles, snake fangs, horn slugs, porcupine quills. The ingredients and preparation method are all on the blackboard. Everything you need is in the cupboard. As Snape finished speaking, the cupboard door slammed open. However, there are no porcupine quills in the cupboard. The quills need to be removed from the porcupine. I need an assistant to help me now. Snape tilted his head, revealing his uneven teeth, and grinned in a sinister smile. "Come on, our Mr. Scamander, aren't you getting impatient?" Potter was as foolish as his father, so simple questions could stump him, but Scamander was reasonably competent, and he needed a practical demonstration to teach him a lesson. Removing the quills from the porcupine was the practical exercise Snape had devised for Scamander. Under everyone's gaze, Ralph slowly walked onto the platform, looking at the porcupine covered in hard quills. Removing porcupine quills sounds easy, like plucking a chicken's feathers, but it's not that simple. Porcupines are covered in quills from their backs to their tails, like a cluster of arrows, especially the quills on their rump, which can reach nearly half a meter in length and are covered with barbs. It's easy to prick yourself if you're not an experienced person. Although they're not poisonous, it's quite painful. Ralph was certainly not an experienced person, and had hardly ever cleaned porcupine quills before. He always bought ready-made ones from stores, his theoretical knowledge far outweighing his practical experience. Trying to do it directly was definitely not an option. But he wasn't panicking. Glancing at the workbench, Ralph turned and began searching the storage cabinet. Snape, thinking the boy was looking for dragon skin gloves, smiled smugly. He had already hidden them. Ralph quickly found a bottle of leech juice and pufferfish eyes in the cabinet. He poured them into a mixing bowl, then took out a small bottle, deliberately covering the label, poured in half the liquid, and threw the bottle into the trash. He crushed and stirred the liquid, then poured it into water. He then put the porcupine into the hot water and boiled it for 1 minute. The porcupine's carcass suddenly contracted in the boiling water, its quills ejected by the contracting muscles and slammed against the cauldron's wall. Ralph retrieved the quills and placed them on the workbench, smiling. "Professor Snape, it's finished." Snape frowned. This was a stripping method he'd never seen before. He glared at Ralph with a piercing gaze and said, "Didn't you follow the steps I mentioned earlier, Professor? You criticized me for being too literal, so I had to try an unconventional method as you suggested," Ralph said, looking aggrieved. "Nonsense." Hufflepuff deduct 5 points. Snape walked over, looking at the porcupine whose quills had been completely removed, and muttered, "Leech juice is an ingredient in shrinking potions. It can indeed shrink porcupines. Add pufferfish eyes. Quite a clever idea." This was definitely not a British magical practice. It looked more like an American custom. "Scamander, who taught you this?" "I learned it from my dad in Hawaii," Ralph chuckled. "What's the other ingredient?" Snape only saw leech juice and pufferfish eyes. The third liquid's label was covered by Ralph, so he couldn't see it and was very curious. "Professor, this is an old family secret recipe, I can't just reveal it." Ralph lowered his head, avoiding eye contact with Snape to prevent him from using legilimency. Eye contact is crucial for legilimency, so the boy simply closed his eyes. Snape was speechless. He could find out by searching the trash can, but he couldn't possibly go and search the trash can in front of everyone. He couldn't bear the embarrassment. Besides, he had a severe case of misophobia. Ralph's lips curled up. He had deliberately covered the label and threw it in the trash can precisely because he understood Snape's curiosity. As for the purpose, Snape coughed hard, then said impatiently with a stern face, "Hufflepuff gets 5 points." All the students stared at the podium in shock. Merlin, Professor Snape was actually giving points to students from other houses. This was like Snape wearing women's clothing, unbelievable. "Professor, this won't do." 10 points. Ralph, seeing that he had the upper hand, grinned and said, "It's onions, Professor, I added onion juice." Satisfied with the answer, Snape immediately changed his expression, waving his hand dismissively and sending Scamander away. Snape suddenly remembered that Hogwarts hadn't held a potions tournament in a long time. Without interaction with other magic schools, this prolonged isolation would lead to this: the technology wouldn't be updated. Everyone took the potion-making materials and began to pair up. Neville wanted to team up with Ralph, but unfortunately, Professor Snape came over again, dragging his robes, and scoffed, "I think Longbottom could team up with Hannah Abbott. 2 idiots together, let's see what sparks they create." Without Neville, Ralph and Sherry were paired together. He had brewed potions for treating boils before and had plenty of practice, so he didn't do much, intending to let Sherry do it alone. But while Sherry was talented in transfiguration, she wasn't so good at potions. The girl frantically tried for a long time, getting her face covered in soot and brewing a large cauldron of green liquid. Sherry frowned at the cauldron, finding this much harder than transfiguration. Seeing this, Ralph took the porcupine quill and helped her brew it again, his movement skillful, and the potion quickly returned to its normal color. Abundant ingredients, a rich broth base, plenty of spices, and equally important control of the heat, all contribute to a shimmering finish. In a way, brewing potions is remarkably similar to making hot pot. Sherry glanced at Ralph, noticing his calm, focused expression, completely absorbed in the process. The girl with the ponytail stuck out her tongue and wiped her face when the boy wasn't looking. Just then, a loud bang resounded, shaking the entire classroom. Ralph reacted quickly, grabbing Sherry's arm and pulling her behind him, then hiding beside the cauldron. The slender girl felt her wrist tighten before Ralph pushed her to the ground. Neville and Hannah's cauldron had exploded, spilling the potion onto the floor in one wall, scalding many large holes. Neville was covered in the potion, his face breaking out in sores, but Hannah was relatively unharmed because Neville had shielded her in the end. "Idiot," Snape roared as he strode over, sweeping away the spilled potion with his wand. Professor Snape was furious. He saw a large puddle of potion spill into his storage cabinet. His precious potion was smoking. Chapter 38 Filch's Repayment. Amid Professor Snape's furious shouts, Ralph took Neville to the school hospital. Madame Pomfrey was displeased. After examining Neville's injuries, she subtly expressed her dissatisfaction with Professor Snape, believing he had failed in his duty as a professor by injuring a young wizard on his very first day of class. It seemed that if she were the headmistress, she would have expelled Snape long ago. This deeply moved Neville, and he then somewhat haphazardly signed the list that Madame Pomfrey produced, titled Supporting Medical Care to Replace Potions Class. Madame Pomfrey's greatest wish was to establish a medical care course at Hogwarts, teaching young wizards how to heal themselves, how to bandage wounds, and how to treat injuries. For this noble cause, she also had lists such as medical care to replace defense against the dark arts and medical care to replace protection of magical creatures. Whichever subject caused a student to be injured, that subject should be abolished. Mrs. Pomfrey turned and stared at Ralph, as if he could leave the school hospital without signing. The boy had no choice but to voluntarily pick up the quill and scribble his name on it in a flourish. Of course, not his own. Signing petitions was too risky. One wrong move and he could face retaliation. Ralph certainly wasn't going to be foolish enough to put his own name on it. After Madame Pomfrey left with satisfaction, Neville lay on a hospital bed covered with clean white linen sheets. His voice was low as he said, "Rover, am I really useless? I can't even brew the simplest potion properly. How could that be?" Rover sat down beside the bed, looking at the dejected Neville. You just lack practice. Go back and brew a few more times. Actually, most students are like you, none of them succeed. I'm stupid, really stupid, just like Professor Snape said. I have no talent. Neville leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. My grandmother also thought I was far inferior to my father when we were kids. Neville, it's not that you lack talent, it's that you lack confidence, Rover said earnestly. Until you put in far more effort than others, don't say you lack talent. Believe in yourself, you can do anything. Of course, if you try and still can't do it, that's okay too. Rover looked at Neville's youthful face and smiled. Everyone has things they're good at or not good at. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Just tell the person you care about that you've tried, but you're really not good at it. She'll understand. Tell Professor Snape that I tried. Neville closed his eyes and imagined the scene, then shuddered and said, That's horrible. Ralph laughed. Professor Snape is indeed horrible. I mean, tell your grandmother, talk to her. Neville raised his head, looking confused, and said, Really, it's never a bad thing to try. Ralph reached out and patted the boy's shoulder. Neville fell silent. Just then, the curtain was pulled open again, and Hermione, Sherry, and Hannah came to visit after class. Hannah, with her pigtails, scrunched up her face, her lips pressed down, trying not to cry. If Neville hadn't been standing in front of her, she would be looking just as miserable. Hermione looked at the boils on Neville's face, gasped, and then, like Madame Pomfrey, began to berate Professor Snape. I'm going to write to Professor Dumbledore to complain about him. The little girl unleashed her trump card again, the complaint letter. She huffed. I raised my hand to answer a question in class, but Professor Snape wouldn't let me answer, only Harry. How can a teacher be so biased? Didn't Madame Pomfrey ask you for your autographs? Ralph asked quietly. You could join her in the complaint. I refused. Hermione shook her head. I prefer potions class to medical care, Sherry said softly. I didn't sign either. If Professor Snape finds out I signed it, he'll definitely hold a grudge. I think so too, Ralph nodded. That's why I wrote Malfoy's name. I wrote Burns' name. Hannah grinned as she peeled an apple for Neville. So, in the end, I was the only one who signed my own name. Neville looked miserable. Madame Pomfrey returned with the potions and, finding too many young wizards visiting, chased Ralph and the others away. But Hannah didn't leave. As a token of gratitude, she decided to stay and take care of Neville. Neville spent his first weekend at Hogwarts in the school hospital, but with Hannah by his side, it wasn't too bad. On Saturday morning, as agreed, Ralph carried his small black suitcase to Filch's office for a follow-up appointment with Madame Norris. Filch's office was on the first floor of Hogwarts Castle, next to the foyer. The room was small, dark, and dirty, with no windows, only a lone oil lamp hanging from the low ceiling. Along the walls were rows of wooden filing cabinets, their labels indicating they contained detailed information on every student Filch had punished. Ralph glanced at one. The records of Fred and George's disciplinary actions alone filled an entire drawer. And this was only the result of 2 years' worth of work. Next to it was another filing cabinet, its drawer labeled confiscated items, high danger. These were all treasures Filch had confiscated from students over the decades. The twins had stolen the Marauders map from here. On the wall behind the desk hung a set of chains, handcuffs, and a whip, suggesting that Filch had quite a few amusing tricks up his sleeve when he was alone. After administering interferon to Mrs. Loris, Ralph examined her thoroughly, inside and out, leaving no detail overlooked. Mrs. Loris let out a pitiful meow, desperately trying to escape Ralph's clutches, but to no avail. Filch watched his cat with a pained expression as Ralph held Mrs. Loris in his arms, stroking her repeatedly, giving him the feeling of a husband abusing his cat. Filch was heartbroken, but there was nothing he could do. Her recovery is going well, but she's still very thin. She needs another course of treatment, and then she'll be almost fine, Ralph said after the examination. Filch quickly took the battered and nearly lifeless Mrs. Loris back into his arms and comforted her. Mr. Scamander, thank you so much. Ralph didn't accept any money, which touched Filch deeply. You're welcome. A doctor's heart is like a parent's. After all, I'm a professional veterinarian. Ralph stood up, put the potion into his small black leather suitcase, and prepared to leave. Mr. Scamander, wait. Filch, panting, seemed to have made up his mind. He took out a small booklet and an old map from a drawer. I saw you were lost earlier. Here are my records of Hogwarts Castle over the years. You can take a look." Ralph hesitated for a moment, then took the map and booklet, flipping through them. They were densely packed with information about the workings of the Hogwarts staircases. There were also some secret passages and passwords, all within the castle, none leading outside. "Thank you so much, Mr. Filch." Ralph really needed this. He was unfamiliar with the area, making even his nighttime patrols difficult. "You're welcome, and you didn't charge me for treating Mrs. Norris." Filch stammered his thanks. "Mrs. Norris can come to me for any problems in the future, free of charge for life," Ralph assured him. Filch nodded in satisfaction. Ralph, carrying the document, headed towards the greenhouse and continued examining the map. The best map would undoubtedly be the Marauder's map, which would not only show secret passages but also the wizards' names and activity status. However, the Marauder's map was in the twins' possession, and Ralph couldn't ask for it. After all, it wasn't his map. He also lacked the ability to create a new Marauder's map. Filch's map, while not marking secret passages outside the castle, was sufficient for a nighttime stroll. Ralph put away the map and booklet in his black leather suitcase, crossed the grass, and quickly arrived at the greenhouse. He needed to find Professor Sprout to deliver the agreed-upon potion and retrieve the seeds he wanted. Entering greenhouse number 1, Ralph walked along the path, and as he passed a grove of trees, he suddenly stopped. He saw an unexpected figure, thanks to, and for their generous donations. Chapter 39. Shirley. A slender figure was bent over, struggling to carry a bucket of water, moving towards the distance. Her wine-red ponytail swayed, like the cool well water rippling in the bucket. Ralph frowned slightly. He stopped and observed for a moment, confirming it was Shirley, before slowly walking towards the thin girl, reaching out to grab the bucket and help her lift the water. Shirley looked up in surprise, realizing it was Ralph. It was Saturday. Why was he here? By the time the girl came to her senses, the boy had already carried the bucket and was a few steps ahead. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and quickly jogged to catch up. "Ralph, what are you doing here? I made an appointment with Professor Sprout to deliver the potion to her today, and then pick up the herb seeds." "What about you?" Shirley pursed her lips, paused for a moment, and said, "Work study, the kind of jobs Hogwarts provides for underprivileged students." Ralph nodded. He remembered that Hogwarts did indeed provide financial aid to young wizards who couldn't afford to attend school. For example, Tom Riddle had received it. The aid wasn't much. After purchasing wands, robes, and other necessities listed on the acceptance letter, there wasn't much left. But the school would provide some jobs so that underprivileged wizards could work part-time without affecting their studies. For a moment, both were silent. Shirley stepped forward, grabbed the bucket, and said, "Let me do it, it's my job." Ralph hummed in agreement but didn't let go. He asked, "Which area should we water?" "Those black trees." Ralph glanced up and whispered, "Guardian trees." Reaching the tree, the boy touched the trunk. Seeing Shirley's curious expression, he explained, "Guardian trees are magical pear trees. Touching their trunks protects you from some dark creatures." The girl with the ponytail blinked, then reached out her right hand to touch the trunk. After a moment's thought, she raised her left hand and touched it hard. As if touching it twice would grant double the protection, Shirley's mood suddenly improved. The bucket of water was quickly emptied after watering only a few trees. Shirley grabbed the bucket, refusing Ralph's help anymore. "I can do it myself. Back in the monastery, I always fetched my own water to wash up, morning and night. Don't let my thin appearance fool you. I'm actually quite strong." Ralph remained silent, following Shirley to the well. He watched her hang the bucket on the rope and lower it in. As the bucket sank to the bottom, the girl struggled to turn the well windlass, which creaked and groaned. Ralph observed for a moment and said, "Shirley, this well is magical. Just tap this brick, and it will automatically bring the bucket up." "Huh?" Hearing Ralph's words, the girl immediately deflated. Her strength lessened slightly, and with a splash, the bucket, halfway up, fell straight back down. How did you know?" "I guessed. I've seen similar magical wells, and this brick has a badger pattern on it. If I'm not mistaken, it's here." Ralph picked up his wand and tapped the brick. Sure enough, the windlass started turning automatically. Shirley sighed, realizing she'd wasted her morning's work. Half her good mood vanished, the other half thanks to the magic well, which would save her a lot of energy. "Didn't Professor Sprout teach you?" "It's my first day. Professor Sprout hasn't had a chance to teach me yet. A group of animals from the Forbidden Forest were harassing the greenhouse, and she went to chase them away. Ralph frowned. What was going on in the Forbidden Forest? Why were they bothering the greenhouse every day? The wooden bucket creaked as it reached the well. Shirley lifted the bucket full of water and placed it on the ground, then untied the rope. Ralph gazed at the girl's thin back, silent for a moment, then asked, "Shirley, how much does the school pay you each month?" 10 galleons, and I only work Saturday and Sunday mornings. That's so little, but with these hours, I can't expect too much." Ralph looked at her, asking the most obvious question with a serious expression. "Shirley, are you short of money?" The girl with the ponytail didn't answer. Her eyes were lowered, her eyelashes trembling slightly. After a moment, she nodded gently and said, "I'm willing to come to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry not only to leave that monastery, but also because Professor McGonagall told me that I can graduate at 18 and then start working and earning money." Ralph gazed into the girl's clear eyes and sighed softly. Shirley, or, how about you be my assistant?" "Huh? I need an assistant." Ralph turned around, his smile widening, and said calmly, "I can give you 30 galleons a month. You're Celia's magical animal shop." The girl blinked her long, clear eyes. "But I don't know how to treat animals." "I don't need you to treat animals. I need you to help me take care of some gentle little animals. Some of them," Ralph scratched his head, carefully choosing his words, "are mischievous." Sherry stared at Ralph, seemingly wondering if the young man was a fraud. She wasn't worth 30 galleons a month. Even selling herself wouldn't be enough. Sherry looked at Ralph, pondered for a moment, and asked with some doubt, "You're not lying to me, are you?" Ralph said calmly, "Hufflepuff students are all honest and trustworthy. They never lie." "Then what about this thing?" Sherry glanced at the bucket she was still carrying. "If you don't do it, Professor Sprout will have house elves do it. They have magic, they won't have to work as hard as you, and they'll be much more efficient." Ralph waved his hand and said, "Come on, let's find Professor Sprout first, then I'll show you the work environment. You'll like it there." Ralph carried a black leather suitcase and walked towards the greenhouse entrance. Just then, Professor Sprout returned from outside. He greeted him, handed him the potion made from Hogwarts juice, and then explained again how he had hired Sherry. Professor Sprout, holding a small steel fork, opened her mouth slightly. Such a pretty little girl, she'd like to train her as an assistant. Even just having her around would be pleasing to the eye. How come she only went out to chase away a badger and came back to find her house robbed? Professor Sprout watched the two figures disappear into the distance, a touch of envy in her eyes. Who hadn't dreamed of being Scamander's assistant in their youth? Ralph walked in front, with Sherry following closely behind. The boy led the girl to an abandoned classroom in Hogwarts Castle. He placed a box on the ground and turned to Sherry, asking, "Are you ready?" "Ready for what?" Ralph raised his right hand, leaving a small gap between his thumb and forefinger. "It'll be a little bigger inside than it looks from the outside, don't be too surprised." The girl looked confused, she'd heard Ralph mention this many times before. Ralph opened the suitcase, tilted his head, and said, "Hurry up and get in." "What are you waiting for? Into where?" "The suitcase." Shirley was full of questions, thinking Ralph had gone mad. How could such a small suitcase fit? The girl instantly conjured up horrific stories of murderers hiding bodies in suitcases, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Ralph had already raised his hand, gently pushing the girl's back, and laughed. "Let's go." Ralph then took a step forward and instantly disappeared into the suitcase, the lid snapping shut. Chapter 40 is bigger inside than outside. Shirley felt her feet slip into thin air, as if her body had been sucked into a sewer. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself in an unfamiliar room. The room was small and simply furnished, containing only a bed, a table, a chair, and a cabinet. On one wall hung various tools for taming magical creatures, fishing rods, nets, ropes, chains, whips, breast pumps, forceps, massage sticks. On another wall were photos of various magical creatures in action, with sticky notes below outlining training and taming plans, as well as precautions for handling them. A long purwood table stood above a cabinet filled with books related to magical creatures, fantastic beasts and where to find them, fantastic beasts in the pot, fantastic beasts in the stomach, on dragon mating, postpartum care of souse, how to help a postpartum depressed unicorn regain confidence, what to do when a niffler doesn't want to have a second puppy. On the table lay a thick notebook, a pointed wizard's hat, and a large pile of manuscripts. On a corner shelf, a medicine cabinet was made up of pills, potions, and flasks, along with several large bags of feed. Sherry was utterly shocked. Her mouth gaped open, unable to utter a single word. After a long pause, she whispered, "Is this inside the box?" "Yes. Is there anything you want to say?" Ralph sat in a chair, smiling at the bewildered girl. Sherry's eyes widened, and she blurted out, "It's much bigger inside than outside, much bigger." Ralph laughed smugly. "I didn't notice. I thought it was just a little bit. Let me tidy up the table. It's a bit messy." Ralph turned and said softly, "Just find somewhere to sit. Don't stand there like an idiot." Sherry looked left and right, only seeing a stool, right under Ralph's bottom. She had no choice but to carefully sit on the bed. She dared not move the blankets, afraid of seeing or touching something she shouldn't. While she was in the convent, the nuns told her that boys her age were all strange. Shirley's attention was quickly drawn to two photos on the bedside table. One was a family portrait of Rove's grandparents and parents. Shirley gazed at the photo with envy, carefully examining each member of Rove's family before concluding that Rove inherited his mother's good looks. Shirley then glanced at the photo next to it, which featured only a beautiful witch. She was animated, beckoning towards the bed, licking her lips in a seductive kiss, and then laughing heartily. Curious, Shirley asked, "Rove, who is this witch?" "My sister Margaret. She goes to the Ivermony magic school," Rove said somewhat awkwardly. "She cast a permanent sticker spell on the back of the photo. I can't remove it." This crazy woman had even tried to tattoo her portrait on Rove's chest last time. Compared to that, simply using a permanent sticker spell to stick a photo on the bedside table was practically normal. Ralph put away his notebook and placed a few phoenix tail feathers in the cabinet. These were from Fox. He was making quill pens to give as Christmas gifts. After tidying up, Ralph stood up, Shirley following behind. They stood before a wooden door with a griffin-shaped brass knocker. Compared to the knocker in the principal's office, the griffin in Ralph's box was much less well-made. He touched his knocker, longing for the others. However, it was this shabby knocker that had protected many magical creatures, preventing them from escaping. Ralph was about to open the door when he suddenly remembered something. He turned and reminded her, "You don't have anything shiny on you, do you? Like galleons or something?" Shirley shook her head, but then quickly remembered something. She reached out her slender fingers and carefully pulled a silver chain around her neck. At the end of the silver chain hung a peculiar cross. The girl gently swayed it and asked, "Does this count?" Ralph stared intently, then reached out and grasped the unusual cross. "So beautiful, and still warm to the touch. What material is it?" Ralph stroked the cross, suddenly remembering that the girl had just taken it from under her neck. Of course it was warm. He quickly let go, cleared his throat, and said, "Hide it well." Sherry's face, ears, and neck were all bright red. If it weren't for Ralph's monthly salary of 30 gallons, she would have already started hitting him. Well, she'd forgotten her baseball bat too. She'd have to carry it with her to work from now on. Ralph turned the doorknob and cautiously opened the door. A creature covered in black fur launched itself forward and rammed into him. Ralph quickly slammed the door shut, and with a thud, the creature crashed into the door, letting out a scream. "What was that?" Sherry cried out. "Nipples, they love shiny things. Hide your cross well, don't let them find it." Rove underestimated the Niffle's ability to escape. Although one Niffle's bumped into the door, another had slipped in sometime earlier. It hung from the ceiling light, trying to steal the bulb, causing the room's light to flicker. Rove snapped his fingers and whispered, "Vine growth." The vines on the bookshelf coiled into the air like snakes, entangling the Niffles, and then flung them towards Rove. The boy caught the Niffles, performed a couple of fancy footwork movements on the ground, and then made a backstepping throwing motion, but didn't actually throw it. He stuffed the dazed Niffles into his pocket. Rove looked at Shirley and smiled, "A bunch of naughty little devils. They'll be your biggest headache in the future." Niffles were indeed very naughty, and very difficult to completely tame. Every Scamander, at the age of 10, can choose one of the 3 starter magical creatures as a companion. Ralph initially chose a Niffler, and the system even issued a thief spell called Stealing as a reward for 100% taming success. Unfortunately, the Nifflers were completely unruly. Ralph had even successfully tamed a Botricle and a Salamander, but still hadn't tamed a Niffler. One could only say, Nifflers will never be slaves. Even if they have to eat, live, and manage the vault. Ralph opened the wooden door and went out first, with Sherry cautiously following behind. Seeing the scene before her, she was completely stunned. She had thought the black suitcase being the size of a small house was already outrageous, but what lay before her was an area larger than a Quidditch pitch. It was more like a small wildlife park, with each animal having its own perfect, magically created habitat. The girl stood there stunned for a long time, then suddenly burst into laughter for no apparent reason, a laugh so hard she had to purse her lips to avoid looking silly. She laughed heartily, just as she had when Professor McGonagall told her she was a wizard, that she could leave the monastery, and be as free as a bird, thanks to the generous donor give me a bottle of wine and a cigarette. Requesting monthly votes at the beginning of the month, thank you all. Chapter 41 The Standard Hufflepuff. In truth, Ralph's trunk wasn't very big. Compared to Newt's trunk, the space in Ralph's black leather trunk was negligible, barely a hair on Fawkes's leg. After all, Newt's trunk had been expanded over decades with the imperceptible stretch charm, gradually expanding its vast space like a foolish old man moving mountains. Newt, after creating Ralph's trunk, stopped after expanding it to a certain extent. He could continue, but there was no need. Ralph was too young, his abilities limited, and his skills in taming magical creatures pitifully few. If the trunk were too large and housed too many magical creatures, he simply couldn't handle it, leading to the animals running rampant, a mass escape, and ultimately sending him to Azkaban. Newt was incredibly experienced in this regard. He was the man who once had a trunk full of magical creatures running down Central Avenue in Manhattan. Ralph understood this, so even though the trunk wasn't very large now, he still limited the number of creatures, leaving plenty of empty space. Ralph was like someone with a roster of 3,000 beauties, but unable to fill it completely. He didn't have the ability to pamper them all. Ralph didn't want the wild magical creatures he captured to slip away and end up being tamed by other wizards. That would change the nature of his Minotaur system, turning him from a blonde-haired wizard into a victim. Even so, the sheer number of magical creatures present was enough to dazzle Sherry. She'd never seen more animals in her entire life. Colorful fairies, vixens, and ladybugs mingled together, buzzing softly. A large swarm of fluffy, creamy yellow caterpillars bounced and chased after tumbleweeds. And then there were giant dung beetles pushing perfectly round balls of dung, preparing to take them home for a leisurely lunch. Ralph and Sherry stood there, awkwardly but politely making way for them. The giant dung beetles were magical creatures that could be 100% tamed, but Ralph had given up on taming them. The system's reward magic was Scavenger, which, like the dung beetle, made the dung round and smooth. He didn't need that magic. Several fork-tailed dung beetles excitedly chased after the dung beetles, seemingly hoping to snag a bite at the buffet. However, outmatched by the giant dung beetles, they could only lick the tracks on the ground to satisfy their cravings. Ralph had never let these dung beetles go hungry, but even if they could have their fill, what little dog could resist the temptation of such a delicious treat as capybara dung? Passing through the Guardian Grove, a group of botricles were battling a woodpecker. The woodpecker had pecked hundreds of holes in a single tree to get insects, a dense, swarming mess, enough to trigger trypophobia. Ralph's grove wasn't fighting, it was curled up on a branch, covered by a leaf, but it wasn't a very still sleeper, kicking most of the leaf off. Ralph didn't wake it, but instead helped it pull the leaf back up. Beside a pond, Shirley unexpectedly spotted Neville's Raffer, perched on a lily leaf, singing in unison with a group of toads. Life no longer wanted to go back to Neville's. Eating and drinking here every day was so much better, and there were plenty of female toads waiting to befriend him. The only problem was that Drove had been giving him some kind of medicine lately, and Leif felt increasingly devoid of worldly desires. Not far away, there was a newly built greenhouse, with a row of transplanted pitcher plants that had become a favorite among many small animals. An armadillo sat up, perched on one, frantically licking the sap. Rove walked over, smacked its head hard, and said sternly, "Don't you know you have diabetes? Even my classmate Malfoy thinks your urine tastes sweet, and you still dare to drink it? Aren't you afraid of dying?" Surely, the armadillo shrank its head, curled into a ball, like a drilling machine, drilled a hole in the ground, and then disappeared. A row of footprints suddenly appeared on the ground, but no animal could be seen. Rove called out, "Uduka, is your stomach still hurting?" An animal with black eyes and long hair, resembling a chimpanzee, slowly appeared. It was an invisible beast, its belly swollen and quite large. Rove walked over, leaned close to the invisible beast's belly, listened for a moment, and then let it go. "Uduka is due to give birth in the next few days," Rove said to Shirley. "But she's a single mother." There was a black invisible beast from Africa with her before, but it ran away as soon as it discovered Uduka was pregnant. Rove was already quite familiar with this invisible beast. Once Uduka safely gave birth to her baby invisible beast, he would gain invisibility magic. Just then, a melody rang out in the sky, ethereal and mysterious. A ball of flame blazed, and then a deep red bird appeared out of thin air. "It's Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes," Ralph said, glancing at the time. "It's already 12. Let's eat here." Not going back to the Great Hall, Shirley nodded, looking up at the phoenix circling overhead, murmuring, "So beautiful." Ralph was face-blind and couldn't tell if Fawkes was beautiful or not, but he was a true glutton, which the boy could tell. Ever since he brought Fawkes some sea hares in the headmaster's office that day, it had been frequently coming to Ralph for food and drinks. Of course, as usual, it had to exchange phoenix tail feathers, to the point that a certain area on Fawkes's rear end had recently become a bit bald. Since Fawkes was here, the ingredients couldn't be cheap. This time, Ralph made nightbird tenderloin steak, a piece of fatty nightbird tenderloin, gently pounded into a thin slice, sprinkled with pepper, then topped with mozzarella cheese and ham, coated with beaten grouse egg, spread with breadcrumbs, and finally placed in a frying pan, with butter and salad added, heated until golden brown. They found a small table, and the two of them and the bird began their meal. Shirley, knife and fork in hand, gently blew on the steaming plate of nightbird tenderloin, then cut a small piece and began to chew slowly. Shirley finally revealed a touch of childlike innocence befitting her age. She looked up and exclaimed excitedly, "So delicious." Fawkes also picked up a piece of tenderloin and swallowed it in large gulps. Ralph glanced at Fawkes's eating habits and sighed inwardly. "Fawkes, look at you, so naive. You've suffered so much following Dumbledore, you're practically bald from hunger. You'd be better off with me." Surprisingly, Sherry finished eating the fastest. After she finished, she looked at Ralph, blushed slightly, and her eyelashes trembled as she said, "I'm not quite full. Would you like another bowl?" Ralph looked up and smiled. "Nightbird meat is very expensive. Deduct it from my salary." Sherry waved her hand. "Deduct it this month, and then next month." But her voice quickly softened. Her previous arrogance vanished, replaced by the shrewdness of a country girl. She said mischievously, "I'm very poor. Could you give me a discount, maybe 30% off?" After finishing his meal, Ralph carried the feed to feed the animals. Sherry sat cross-legged on a small hill, Fawkes singing beside her. A gentle breeze caressed their faces, causing the girls' red hair and sideburns to sway. Sherry, who was quite full, suddenly burst into tears for no apparent reason. Fawkes gently peeked at the girl's ponytail, seemingly to comfort her. Sherry suddenly stood up and called out to the retreating figure in the distance, "Rolf, I accepted the job. When do we sign the contract?" Rolf looked up, startled, and said, "Contract? Yes, if we don't sign a contract, I'm afraid you'll change your mind and leave me." Sherry shouted, "I don't know anything. I'm clumsy. I can't even use Professor Sprout's magical well." "It's okay, I'll teach you." The girl looked at the figure entangled by a group of nifflers and smiled. "Thank you." Rolf grinned, scratched his head, said nothing, and continued squatting down to shovel poop for the nifflers. The boy thought for a moment, thinking, "Kind-hearted me, I guess I'm still a typical Hufflepuff." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42 Malfoy, Scamander, we're actually related. What does it take to become a great magizoologist? Just look at Newt, a large number of magical creatures acquired illegally, or even criminally, a portable magical box, extensive knowledge of taming, and a female assistant. A female assistant is crucial for a magizoologist, just like Bondi is to Newt, Bond girls are to 007, female companions are to Doctor Who, and Watson is to Sherlock. Wait, something seems off. Ralph has the box now, but his collection of magical creatures is still growing, and his skills, so, he's working overtime to learn. Looking at it this way, the only thing he lacks to become great is a female assistant. Considering Ralph is only 11 years old, even a skilled witch wouldn't accept a mere 30 galleons as his assistant. Therefore, starting from a young age and nurturing her is essential. So, although Sherry doesn't know anything, Ralph is generally satisfied with his little assistant. Of course, It would be better if she ate a smaller portion. The girl looks so thin, yet she eats meat more voraciously than Fawkes. Actually, Ralph didn't need to teach Sherry every day. The Scamander family had portraits of experienced magical creature trainers. They provided guidance during his work. This was true family tradition. Many training techniques couldn't be learned through trial and error or by reading a few books, but required the oral instruction of an old wizard. This was the biggest advantage of a wizarding family compared to Muggle-born wizards. Although he had found an assistant, Ralph was still very busy this weekend. Besides treating Lyford's ADHD, he also had to worry about a pregnant invisible beast Uduca. More and more young wizards came to him for pet treatment. So far, it was mostly cats and owls, but at least it was moving in a positive direction. Ralph believed that soon students would bring him strange magical creatures for treatment. There were quite a few young wizards like Lee Jordan who brought creatures like bag spiders. On Monday morning, Ralph and Neville went to the Great Hall. They had already adapted to school life and woke up early this time. Macmillan and Justin, his two roommates, had also adapted to school life, or more accurately, Hufflepuff life. They were still sleeping in bed, with house elves delivering their meals, which they ate on the go via a secret passage through the kitchen. Their commute took no more than 5 minutes. Therefore, they could sleep for a long time. Ralph didn't like eating in the dorm, he preferred the Great Hall. In his previous life, he had once eaten snail rice noodles in his dorm. The dorm supervisor thought the toilet had exploded and rushed over with masks and tools, creating a rather awkward scene. Neville's boil had completely healed without leaving any scars, but he was still somewhat unhappy. Neville had hoped that Hannah would stay with him in the ward longer if he recovered slowly, but Madame Pomfrey kicked him out on Saturday morning. Ralph ate breakfast while flipping through his Transfiguration book. There weren't many students in Hufflepuff, and his reading here made him stand out even more, making him look like a Ravenclaw. Just then, a flock of owls flew overhead, and a package landed precisely in Neville's bowl, splashing milk all over his face. Ralph hadn't received the package. Sending packages from Romania or America by owl across the ocean was simply too difficult. Neville opened his package. This time, it wasn't Mrs. Longbottom's howling letter, but a crystal ball. Neville held up the crystal ball excitedly. Ralph, it's a memory ball. Grandma knows I'm always forgetful, so she sent me a memory ball. It tells you if you've forgotten something. Look, just hold it, like this. If it turns red, that means you've forgotten something. Neville suddenly frowned, because the memory ball was a deep, almost purple red, but he tried hard to remember what he'd forgotten. Did you forget to do your homework? Ralph thought for a moment and said, It's Transfiguration homework? It's too soon. Neville stared blankly. He had indeed forgotten. Ralph sighed. He'd been busy with Sherry in the box for the past 2 days and had forgotten to remind Neville. Just say you lost your homework, Ralph suggested, or that Rafford chewed it up. That's no better than honestly admitting you forgot to do it, Neville sighed. The punishment for lying is much worse, and Professor McGonagall's temper. What's wrong with me, Mr. Longbottom? Professor McGonagall walked over from a distance, with Malfoy following behind her. Professor McGonagall, good morning, have you eaten? Ralph saw Neville completely stunned and had to help him out, greeting him warmly. If you haven't eaten, why don't you eat at the Hufflepuff table? Oh, I've eaten, Mr. Scamander. Professor McGonagall wasn't used to this have you eaten greeting. She glanced at the Transfiguration notes on Ralph's desk and gave him an approving look. Any child who is willing to work hard to learn Transfiguration is a good child. Of course, McGonagall hadn't forgotten about the boy hugging her, so she kept a distance, not daring to get too close, afraid that the boy would suddenly go berserk. Mr. Scamander, the Ministry of Magic has replied to me. Mr. Diggory said that your trunk was checked and there was indeed no matcha rat on it. Professor McGonagall looked at Malfoy and said, Mr. Malfoy, is there anything else you want to say? Malfoy shook his head. Professor McGonagall pursed her lips and said, I'm sorry, Mr. Malfoy, Slytherin will lose 10 points, and you'll also have to be put in solitary confinement. Where will you be put in solitary confinement? Ralph asked curiously. Not in Professor Snape's office, is it? Professor McGonagall obviously knew that being put in solitary confinement in Snape's office was like a day trip. Who knows, he might get another 10 points just because Malfoy stepped in with his left foot first. It's with Mr. Filch. That's the end of it. Professor McGonagall was about to leave when she glanced at the red memory orb in Neville's hand. She said softly, Mr. Longbottom, your grandmother used to like playing with this thing, and she always forgot to do her charms homework. You didn't forget to do your homework too, did you? Neville immediately blushed and stammered. When I am in class, I'll check your transfiguration homework first. Don't say you forgot it or lost it, those are excuses Augusta used to death. Professor McGonagall turned and walked away quickly, but Malfoy didn't leave. He pulled a wallet made of a shape-shifting lizard from his pocket and said with a fawning expression, "Mr. Scamander, this is compensation for what I owe you. For now, I only have this wallet, I'll get the other one for you later." Ralph hummed in agreement, not paying much attention. However, with Sherry's salary secured for the year, he wanted to continue reading. But then Malfoy sat down beside him. "I haven't had breakfast yet, do you mind?" Malfoy's pale face flushed slightly. Malfoy wasn't really interested in eating. He hesitated for a moment, then whispered excitedly, "Mr. Scamander, I wrote back to check the family genealogy, and I discovered we're actually related." Ralph quickly interrupted, "Most pure-blood wizards are related, it's nothing. Pure-blood wizards have very few marriage partners to maintain their bloodline, like the Weasleys and Malfoy, even rival families are related. I mean, we're relatives, we can team up, right?" Malfoy rubbed his hands together, looking mysterious. "Scamander, are you short of money?" Ralph felt this sounded familiar. He looked at him strangely and said, "Are you going to hire me as your assistant?" "Assistant?" Malfoy shook his head. "Of course not. I mean, we can team up and collect protection money from those little wizards, we can split it 50-50. Seeing Ralph's expression, Malfoy quickly added, 70-30 is fine too, you get 70%, I get 30%, he said with a long face. "We can't do 80-20, can we? Thanks for the donation." Chapter 43 Flying Broom. Walking to the classroom, Malfoy hummed a little tune, feeling rather cheerful. His biggest dream at Hogwarts was to subdue a group of pure-blood lackeys, lead them to power, and become the leader of the students. As long as he didn't speak, even the prefects and the student council president wouldn't have any influence. But who knew that before he could even take that first step? On the train, his two lackeys, Goyle and Crabbe, returned crying and shouting that they'd been beaten up by a blonde boy. This was unacceptable. Malfoy always sided with his own people, regardless of the reason. His lackeys had been beaten, and as their leader, he had to get revenge, otherwise, how could he remain in charge? And then, nothing happened. Malfoy had already paid out a large amount of galleons and magical items, ruined his reputation, caused many girls to believe he liked Goyle, and was even facing detention. He couldn't even get past a small Scamander. How could he talk about being in charge? How could he talk about becoming powerful? So, Malfoy racked his brains, suffered several sleepless nights, and pondered for a week before finally coming up with a brilliant plan. If he couldn't beat them, he'd join them. If the two of them teamed up, Ralph's beating of him and his underlings would at most be considered a case of friends through a fight, not something shameful. With Scamander's strength and Malfoy's own wealth, he was confident this small group could quickly grow in Hogwarts. As for who would be the leader, two leaders weren't out of the question. At the very least, Malfoy considered himself slightly stronger than the second in command, at least a 1.5, right? Although Ralph didn't immediately agree, Malfoy felt there was a chance. After all, he hadn't rejected him. As he approached the charms classroom, Malfoy was still thinking about it, growing more and more excited. He turned his head and saw Potter and Weasley. The two entered the classroom chatting and laughing, and as they passed each other, Potter didn't even glance at him. Malfoy's good mood vanished instantly. His initial target was Harry Potter, this boy who had miraculously survived. He wanted to be friends with him, to be his best friend, but Weasley had stolen him away. He was the one who got there first, whether it was meeting Harry at Madame Morkan's shop, chatting, or even their first close encounter. Malfoy stared intently at Harry's retreating figure. He was going to Filch's for detention, but he couldn't go alone. Draco secretly vowed to bring someone with him. Regarding Malfoy's invitation, Ralph didn't say anything, but he refused without a second thought. He could never agree to the offer. What would Dumbledore think if he knew? A first-year student, already daring to form a clique at school, uniting with pure-blood wizards, collecting protection money. He couldn't even imagine what he'd be like when he grew up. Did he not want to graduate and apply to stay at school as a defense against the dark arts professor? What on riddle I? Ralph was just an honest, unassuming Hufflepuff wizard who enjoyed keeping pets and occasionally taking advantage of Hogwarts resources. How could he possibly do something so sensitive? He didn't want to be expelled. Ralph was even more concerned about flying lessons than Malfoy's suggestion. On Tuesday afternoon, a notice was posted in the Hufflepuff common room announcing the start of first-year flying lessons. This excited the young wizards, who enthusiastically discussed Quidditch and flying broomsticks. Even Professor Flitwick, seeing everyone's excitement, couldn't resist teaching the basics of riding a broomstick in class. The key is to keep your waist and broomstick as one. Professor Flitwick added dozens of books to his feet to elevate himself, so everyone could see his slender waist. Don't let my slightly shorter stature fool you. I'm incredibly strong. I can jump and hit Hagrid's knee. It's all thanks to my core strength, you know. To prove he wasn't exaggerating, Professor Flitwick was about to give the young wizards 2,000 crunches, but then realized the space was too small and he had to give up. When Hannah asked Professor Flitwick about his Quidditch skills, he proudly declared, "My old nickname was Little Flying Squirrel, those heavy hitters. I could take them down with my small size, one height and I'd be right." It was like child's play. The young wizards pressed on, asking why, if he knew so much about Quidditch, he couldn't train any good players, resulting in the Ravenclaw Quidditch team's abysmal record. Professor Flitwick said his back wasn't feeling well and left get out of class a few minutes early. During class, Professor McGonagall showed everyone her treasured collection of autographed Quidditch jerseys and 16 ancient flying broomsticks. This included the first broomstick specifically designed for the tournament, the one-star sweeper, which was rumored to be selling for 10,000 galleons each. Professor McGonagall even analyzed the pros and cons of various flying broomsticks on the market, suggesting that even if she weren't a teacher at Hogwarts anymore, she could easily become an excellent saleswoman at the Flying Broomstick Company. Even Professor Quirrell stammered out his story of battling a troll on his flying broomstick. Unfortunately, he was no match for the troll's brutal onslaught and surrendered within minutes, suffering a crushing defeat that resulted in his wand breaking. The students were also enthusiastically discussing Quidditch. Malfoy spent all his time talking about flying techniques, complaining that freshmen weren't qualified to join the school's Quidditch team, and that Slytherin would definitely win the championship this year if you were there. He also mentioned that his father was considering acquiring Nimbus Company, even though Nimbus Company's market value was several times that of the Malfoy family's assets. Ernie Macmillan also believed he should join the Hufflepuff Quidditch team. After all, his mother gave birth to him on a flying broomstick, and he had an inexplicable connection with the broomsticks from birth. Justin wrote to the Nimbus Corporation asking them to send him a Nimbus 2000, and after being refused, he became furious, declaring himself a master of spells and that he would dig up the slowing charm and breaking charm invented by the Nimbus Corporation and publish them in the Daily Prophet. Hannah and Burns had been arguing for days about whether McFarlane or Quigley was the greater player. Hannah believed that although Quigley had 4 titles, he played for 4 different teams, forming super teams everywhere, building a nomadic dynasty, which was less valuable. Burns, however, felt that although McFarlane had 4 titles in one city, he only received a Dangerous Day medal, falling short in terms of major honors. The two had already fought 3 times over this, each time ending with them torn and disheveled. Neville was nervous. Although he came from a wizarding family, he had never ridden a flying broomstick before. His grandmother thought his intelligence and athletic ability weren't up to par with such a dangerous instrument. Hermione, on the other hand, seemed quite calm. She borrowed a book called Quidditch Origins from the library and tried to learn Quidditch skills by looking at the pictures every day. She found a broken broomstick used for sweeping in some corner and secretly practiced with Sherry every day when no one was around. Seeing the 2 silly girls practicing on a broomstick that couldn't fly, Ralph was speechless. "If you really want to learn ahead of time, I'll lend you my broomstick." "You have a flying broomstick?" Hermione asked in surprise. "Aren't first-year wizards not allowed to bring them?" "Oh, you're breaking the rules again." "Don't talk nonsense," Ralph lied without batting an eye. "I brought a toy broomstick, not a real flying broomstick. It's a toy for young wizards to practice with. It's very safe." "There are such products?" Hermione was intrigued. "Yes, it's suitable for wizards under 2 years old to practice." Chapter 44, Power Source Unknown, grows stronger when facing stronger opponents. On Wednesday afternoon, Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw had their first flying lesson. The lesson was held on a lawn not far from the castle. When the Ravenclaw students arrived, they found the Hufflepuff students were already there. The little badgers, arriving so early for the first time, were even more enthusiastic than Professor Sprout's herbology class, while the Ravenclaw students were listless and uninterested. Their own Quidditch team consistently finished at the bottom, failing to cultivate a team culture, so their lack of interest was understandable. Most importantly, the Ravenclaw Quidditch captain always delivered a thunderous verbal sparring match, stirring up the young Eagles' emotions, who were all eager to kick Gryffindor and punch Slytherin. The atmosphere was built up, but there was no actual action. The team's consistently top four finish year after year only added to the disappointment. It wasn't just the Ravenclaw students who were disappointed, the little Badgers were also disappointed when they saw the row of flying broomsticks in the distance. They had indeed fantasized that the school might provide Luminous 2000s, the latest model of flying broomsticks this year. Even without such a luxurious broom, the 7-star sweeper would be decent. The 7-star sweeper is a product of the Sweeper Company, known for its cost-effectiveness. While the Sweeper series has never lost in terms of configuration, its user experience hasn't been superior, and it occasionally has breaking issues. Its specifications are still close to the Nimbus 2000. At the very least, we could use the Nimbus 1700, a major version behind, or the 5-stars Sweeper. If all else fails, the Comet 290 is a classic model, barely adequate. But they never expected that Hogwarts would use the Meteor series flying brooms. In their recent Transfiguration class, Professor McGonagall had introduced this antique, a flying broom introduced in 1955. It was the cheapest competition broom on the market from the moment it was released. Decades later, even using it for splits or firewood is considered too smoky. Most importantly, the Cosmic Broom Company, which produced a Meteor brooms, went bankrupt back in 1978, leaving them without even maintenance personnel, let alone replacement parts. Is Hogwarts really this poor now? Or is this the heritage of an ancient magic school, completely different from those nouveau-riche schools that use semi-used things? This isn't even semi-used, it's practically an antique from the junkyard. Madam Hooch strode over, her short gray hair and yellow, eagle-like eyes catching her eye. Seeing the students whispering amongst themselves, she seemed a little embarrassed and said, "The new brooms will be here soon. This month, cough cough, this term, you'll have to make do." This sounded just like those schools' promises. Air conditioning will be installed next year. Unfortunately, next year after next, by the time you graduate, it might actually be installed. Alright, shooting stars aren't so bad. They're slower, but safer, Madam Hooch said loudly. Quick, hurry up, everyone stand next to your flying brooms. If you're fast enough, you might be able to fly 20 meters today. The young wizards all found a broom they liked and stood to one side, with Sherry and Neville on either side of Ralph. Extend your right hand and place it above the broom handle, Mrs. Hodge shouted. Then shout "Arise," with feeling. From the bottom of your heart, shouting "Arise" didn't mean much, it was just a ritual, like patting a watermelon before buying it. Ralph's arm was above the broom. Thanks to the Botricle's magic, he had a special affinity for plants, even wood made into brooms. He didn't say a word, and the broom eagerly jumped into his hand without hesitation. Mrs. Hodge glanced at Ralph in surprise. Shouts rose and fell across the lawn. Shirley's broom slowly rose into the air and finally landed gently in her hand. Neville's broom seemed broken, it wouldn't budge on the ground. Hannah's broom, however, leaped nimbly and slammed heavily onto the girl with pigtails forward with a loud thud. The girl stared blankly, touched her swollen forehead, and suddenly squatted down, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. Macmillan, who was supposedly born on a flying broomstick, found his broomstick half dead, twitching on the ground like an eel. He stomped on it, and the wood snapped in two. Amidst these repeated calls, whether summoned or secretly picked up, every student now had a broomstick. Mrs. Hodge explained the construction of the flying broomstick and the proper riding posture, and each student climbed onto one. The earliest flying broomsticks didn't have invisible cushions. This was during the Morgan era of Quidditch. Elios Mason invented the cushion charm, which solved this problem perfectly, so all broomsticks now had invisible cushions, making them quite comfortable. Of course, because the broomsticks had been used for so long, many cushions were worn out, making them a bit slippery. Mrs. Hodge walked through the group, correcting the student's grip. Alright, when I whistle, you all push off the ground with your legs, push hard, Madam Hooch shouted. Hold your broom steady, rise a few meters, then lean forward slightly and land vertically back on the ground. Everyone, listen to my whistle, but Neville was too nervous. Before the whistle even sounded, he flinched and flew up. Neville spun wildly in the sky like a cork expelled from a bottle. Students in class in the castle, hearing the screams, couldn't help but gather at the windows to watch. Madame Hooch fully demonstrated the uneven quality of Hogwarts teachers. She simply stood on the ground shouting, "Come back, child. Come back." Ralph suddenly felt that another spot could be added to Hermione's complaint list. Watching Neville still spinning in the sky, Ralph sighed. Although Neville had been wanting to be admitted to the school hospital recently, he couldn't actually watch him go in. But the flying broomstick in his hand was too slow to start. At this speed, he'd be crashing by the time he reached Neville. He needed some acceleration. Ralph took a few seeds from his pocket and tossed them to the ground. The seeds quickly sprouted, growing into several elastic vines that coiled into the shape of a giant bow. Using the vines as the bow and the broomstick as the arrow, the boy silently controlled the vines, drawing the bow to its fullest extent. The flying broomstick shot into the air like an arrow, whistling through the wind. The next moment, Ralph was also entangled in the vines and flung into the sky. Like an arrow shot from a fully drawn bow, he instantly arrived beside the broomstick, maintaining a relatively stationary speed. The broomstick lowered slightly, and Ralph placed his feet on the wooden pole, the vines binding him and the broomstick together for balance. The man and the broomstick charged towards Neville with tremendous force. The boy stood on his flying broomstick, the wind whipping around him, his sleeves billowing and rustling, as if he were flying on a sword. Neville couldn't hold on any longer. He let go and was flung away by the broomstick, his body crashing against the castle wall before slamming to the ground. Neville was now far from Ralph's flight path, so the boy twisted his waist, bent over like a cat, and controlled the broomstick to make a wide arc in mid-air, leaping towards Neville. At the last second, Ralph finally arrived, grabbing Neville's ankles and spinning him around before slowly descending to the ground. Look, Professor Flitwick, who was teaching Gryffindor and Slytherin, shouted, "That's what I mean by core strength. I was that good back in the day." After grabbing Neville, Ralph sat on the broomstick and slowly descended. As he landed on the second floor, he saw a tabby cat standing by the window, its pupils wide with shock. Ralph flew over and chuckled, "Professor McGonagall, good afternoon. Are you sunbathing here?" Professor McGonagall snapped out of her reverie, noticing Ralph's approach. She hastily leaped down and quickly transformed back into a witch. Ralph was speechless. He wasn't some cat-petting fanatic. There was no need for such wariness. Professor McGonagall recalled the thrilling scene of Ralph rescuing Neville, her expression turning strange. She suddenly remembered what the captain had told her when she joined the Gryffindor Quidditch team: mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, fearless against anyone. Power source unknown, but stronger against stronger opponents. Thanks to book friend 160,610,140,048,481 for the generous donation. Chapter 45 Hagrid. Neville was back in the school hospital. Physically, he was fine, but psychologically, he was traumatized. Just a few days later, Mrs. Pomfrey was delighted to see Neville again, and then pulled out a list titled Supporting Medical Care in Replacement of Flight Lessons. This time, Neville was smarter and decisively signed Malfoy's name. If Mrs. Pomfrey hadn't been there, he would have signed Mrs. Hooch's name. But Mrs. Pomfrey wasn't stupid either. She not only didn't cross out Malfoy's name, but also made Neville write his own name after it. She called it, "The signature is authentic and reliable." The scene of Ralph throwing his flying broomstick with the air of an arrow, then saving Neville high in the sky, was witnessed by many students, sparking heated discussion. Riding the worst Meteor Series broomstick, he could be so fast and stable. What if he had a better flying broomstick? The sky was far from Scamander's limit. Even Quidditch Captain Truman approached Ralph, saying he would plead with Professor Sprout to ask Dumbledore to make an exception and at least secure Ralph a substitute spot. Seeing Neville's miserable experience, Hermione, who had initially thought she could master Quidditch simply by reading books, felt a pang of anxiety. Before her Gryffindor flying lesson, after much deliberation, she decided to have practical training with Ralph. Being thoroughly mocked by Ralph was better than being flung into the air like Neville in front of everyone, right? So, in the evening, Ralph took Hermione and Sherry to the edge of the school for their practical demonstration. Neville didn't want to come. He had developed some psychological issues and found it difficult to face flying broomsticks again. Of course, Hannah's planned visit that evening was probably the main reason for his reluctance. The three crossed the large lawn and arrived at the edge of Hogwarts. In the distance lay a deep, ancient forest, lush and eerily dark, with the occasional mournful cawing of crows in the branches adding to the chilling atmosphere. Hermione clung to Shirley's arm, half her body hanging on her to ease her fear. The girl swallowed hard and asked, "Why are we practicing here? You said it yourself. First-year wizards aren't allowed to bring flying brooms, so of course we need to find a secluded place," Ralph explained. This was the edge of the Forbidden Forest, rarely visited by students, allowing for safe and unrestricted practice. Ralph actually preferred teaching at the Room of Requirement, but he'd just been there and couldn't open it, meaning someone was using it, though he didn't know who. A toy broom suitable for a 2-year-old? It doesn't violate school rules, right? Hermione asked, somewhat suspiciously. Ralph placed the black suitcase on the ground, unable to suppress a laugh. "It was indeed a birthday present from my dad when I was 2, but after he bought it, he's played with it most of the time." "Is the broom you bought when you were 2 still up to par?" Hermione worried about the model, fearing it might be as bad as the school brooms. "Hermione, let me ask you, your family's car, today they changed the BMW engine, tomorrow the Mercedes tires, the day after the Rolls-Royce chassis." Ralph opened the box, turned around and asked, "Changing parts like this every day, even replacing the glass in the end, is it still the same car? Don't be fooled by this 9-year-old flying broomstick. Every year it gets the latest parts, uses the best technology, and undergoes annual upgrades. Just the materials alone are more expensive than a Nimbus 2000 on the market." Ralph had done something similar in his previous life. Afraid of being discovered by his parents, he replaced the CPU and graphics card of his computer, only keeping the casing. It still looked like the old computer from back then. The ending was tragic. He wasn't home for the holidays, and his parents sold it to a scrap dealer as junk. Ralph snapped out of his reverie and pulled a meticulously modified flying broomstick from the black box, a mahogany handle from a Nimbus 2000, the excellent elasticity of a Release Aero 13, a built-in alarm whistle and self-straightening tail from a Twig 90, and a braking device capable of sweeping across the 7 stars. Only a true broomstick enthusiast could have successfully modified it, and the cost of this broomstick was enough to buy 4 or 5 Nimbus 2000s, and it was also significantly faster. So, Ralph secretly took it when school started. After all, it was his second birthday present. Sherry had already taken flying lessons, and she could clearly feel how sensitive this broomstick was. With just a slight lift of her arm, the broomstick appeared in her palm. She tried riding it for a while, and the feeling of controlling it perfectly was truly comfortable. Indeed, the only downside to expensive things is the price. After Sherry played for a while, it was Hermione's turn, and Ralph began his teaching session. Chest out, stomach in, grip the broomstick tightly, lift your buttocks, there's a cushion here, Hermione, you can lift your butt a little higher. Don't squeeze your legs so tightly, your body is so stiff. Didn't you say you took ballet classes? Where's your flexibility? Hermione blushed and glared at Rove resentfully. The little girl was clever, figuring out how to ride the flying broomstick in a few minutes, but she didn't dare ride too high. But Sherry dared. She took Hermione and soared through the air, rapidly rising into the sky above the Forbidden Forest, their 2 figures gradually becoming tiny, like grains of rice. Rove watched their figures disappear into the distance, thinking that the flying broomstick could actually seat 3 people. It was almost dark when Sherry returned with Hermione. Sherry was alright, but Hermione's fluffy brown hair had exploded like a lion's mane. The girl landed dizzily, her legs a little weak, and with Sherry's help, she plopped down on Rove's small black leather suitcase, making Rove's lips twitch. Just then, a trembling sound suddenly came from deep within the forest. Ralph raised his wand, the tip glowing, and a tall figure emerged from the Forbidden Forest, twice the height of an ordinary person, with long, tangled black hair and a tangled beard that almost completely obscured his face. He carried a shivering dog in his thick arms. "Hagrid? Long time no see," Ralph waved and greeted him. Hagrid hadn't expected to see several young wizards at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. He stared at the boy for a moment before realizing, is that Ralph? Long time no see. The last time I saw you, you were about this size, Hagrid gestured, pointing to the baby in his arms. "Hagrid, let me introduce you. This is Sherry and Hermione," Ralph said softly. "Ravenclaw and Gryffindor students. I'm teaching them how to fly with broomsticks. There are fewer people here. Hello. My name is Rubius Hagrid, the Hogwarts key keeper and game field keeper." Hagrid smiled. I was wondering why I saw something flying in the sky earlier. Turns out you guys were riding flying broomsticks. They're faster than any broomstick I've ever seen, Hagrid said enviously. When I was 8, I was too tall and heavy for the broomsticks on the market to support me. You can buy flying broomsticks from Eastern Europe. Quidditch matches at Cordostadthurst School of Witchcraft and Wizardry are all played on a big tree, Ralph laughed. I still prefer Muggle motorcycles, Hagrid blinked. I have a really big motorcycle that can fly. I've seen it before, back in the Dragon Sanctuary in Romania. Yeah, look at my memory, Hagrid laughed. How's your Grandpa Newt doing? He's doing well. He was just telling me he missed your rock bread. Ralph couldn't help but shudder at the memory of those rock breads that could break your teeth. Haha, come find me if you want some, Hagrid laughed. Let's go, it's getting dark. Don't linger on the edge of the school. The Forbidden Forest is dangerous lately. The group packed up and left, with Ralph putting his broom back in his box. Hermione was already used to it. She'd been researching recently, trying to figure out why Ralph's small box had such a large interior space. She was almost there. What's wrong with the Forbidden Forest lately? Professor Sprout said a bunch of harpies keep harassing her greenhouse, Ralph asked curiously. I don't know either. These animals have never been this aggressive before, Hagrid shook his head. And there's a strange fellow who attacked a unicorn in the Forbidden Forest. The centaurs know who it is, but they won't say. Those arrogant fools. Are any unicorns injured? Ralph was concerned. Unicorns are difficult to approach. They only allow young girls to get close. If Ralph could rescue an injured unicorn, he'd more easily get a reward. It's just a minor injury, nothing serious. Hagrid's dark eyes looked at Ralph, and he reminded him, Ralph, don't go into the Forbidden Forest lately, understand? I know you, the Scamander family is always restless, but the Forbidden Forest is really dangerous. Look at Tooth, even this fierce dog is scared like this. Chapter 46 Let go of the urge to help others and respect their fate. The group quickly bid farewell to Hagrid and headed towards the castle. Ralph politely declined Hagrid's invitation to go inside and try some rock cakes. Hagrid's rock cakes, when thrown, could knock out a unicorn. It wouldn't even bite its teeth. As for Hagrid's warning, Ralph naturally took it to heart, so if he went to the Forbidden Forest, he would definitely bring enough magical creatures to protect himself. The long-pregnant invisible beast, Uduca, was finally about to give birth, which excited Ralph. Magical creatures show clear signs before giving birth, including rhythmic abdominal pain and spotting, caused by uterine contractions and the separation of the amniotic sac from the uterine wall. In fact, the invisible beast had stopped eating and drinking a day in advance, searching for a safe haven to give birth. The biggest challenge in helping an invisible beast give birth was that it would become invisible at the slightest sign of danger. Ralph spent a long time with Uduca before gaining its trust enough to enter the birthing room. Sherry, for example, was completely unapproachable. Her unfamiliar scent made the invisible beast uneasy. The entire delivery process was completed by Ralph alone. Shirley, his new assistant, couldn't help at all. Ralph's job was to prevent the invisible beasts from becoming exhausted, experiencing dystocia, or suffering severe bleeding during labor. If they became exhausted, they needed to be given timely nutritional support. In case of dystocia, forceps or a vacuum extractor would be placed on the fetal head to create a negative pressure zone. Severe bleeding had many causes, including placenta previa, placental abruption, and rupture of the placental marginal sinuses. Fortunately, the entire process went extremely smoothly, without the dilemma of saving the mother or the babies for Ralph to choose from. After a flurry of activity, Ralph cut the umbilical cord and pulled out 2 female pups. They blinked their eyes, pursed their lips, and stared at Ralph, crying heart-wrenchingly. Clearly, they wanted to nurse. As a male mother, Ralph naturally wouldn't refuse. He immediately placed the little invisible beasts under Uduca. After tidying up the entire room, Ralph checked it carefully one last time before leaving. He glanced at the system. The mission was complete, and he had obtained the invisible beast's magic, shadowless and invisible. With a thought, he vanished into thin air. Beside the stream stood a pretty girl with a ponytail, holding a handful of corn and feeding it to a ball-eating bird. A large ball-eating bird led a flock of fluffy yellow chicks, pecking at the food. Sherry suddenly felt someone tap her left shoulder. She turned her head but saw no one. Then someone tapped her right shoulder. Ralph was about to tug at Sherry's ponytail when the girl raised a delicate pink fist and punched him straight at the head. Ralph couldn't dodge in time and was hit in the eye. It didn't hurt, but it was still quite embarrassing. Ripples spread through the air, gently swaying, and the boy slowly revealed himself. He covered his eyes and said, "Shirley, why did you hit me so hard?" The girl pointed to the broken baseball bat not far away and teased, "If I really hit someone hard, I would have used it to hit them." "Who told you to tease me like that? How did you know I was in this direction?" Ralph asked curiously. "You just gave birth, and you smelled so much blood." Shirley sniffed and asked with concern, "How is Uduka?" "She gave birth to twins, and both mother and daughters are safe." Ralph bent down and picked up a ball escaper that was eating corn at his feet. It disappeared with a snap and reappeared not far away. "You've learned a disillusionment charm?" Shirley asked. "Yes, I'm planning to go to the library in the next few days," Ralph smiled. Shirley wasn't surprised. Although the disillusionment charm wasn't something a young wizard of this age could learn, it was normal for Ralph. After all, how many young wizards could cast spells without a wand like him? "Need my help?" "Yes," Ralph nodded. "I can't catch that wretched silverfish by myself." The boy turned and walked towards the cabin, waving lightly. "I'm going back to the Hufflepuff common room to shower. Let's have dinner in the Great Hall tonight." "Not eating here." Sherry licked her lips, missing Ralph's cooking. "No," the boy shook his head, refusing. "You hit me just now. I'm not in the mood to cook tonight. You can hit me back." Sherry trotted after the boy, tilting her head back, looking adorably resigned to being hit or scolded. "Then I still won't cook for you." The girl wrinkled her nose and muttered, "Stingy." Ralph took a shower, washing away the smell of blood, before returning to the Great Hall. He had just sat down when Hermione sneaked over and whispered, "During flying class, Malfoy and Harry Potter got into a fight." Ralph raised an eyebrow. He'd already brought Neville to Hufflepuff. How could Malfoy and Harry still clash in flying class? Malfoy wanted to race Potter, but Mrs. Hooch sternly stopped him, Hermione explained. The butterfly effect caused by Ralph still had its consequences. Without Neville, and without Mrs. Hooch leaving flying class, Harry and Malfoy's antics were stopped. Harry didn't have the chance to soar through the air on his broomstick, and Professor McGonagall wouldn't have discovered his Quidditch talent, let alone suggested he become a Quidditch player. "They agreed to duel after class tonight," Hermione whispered. "I overheard Potter and Weasley discussing it while I was eating." "Oh, that's good, a man's way of settling things out." I remember Malfoy's going to Filch's for timeout tonight." "Right," Ralph frowned. "Yeah, Malfoy's going to be in detention. How could he possibly duel Potter?" "He deliberately lured Potter there so Filch could catch him and deduct points from Gryffindor." Ralph couldn't help but laugh. Malfoy looked like a simpleton, but he was surprisingly cunning. "Did you tell them?" Ralph asked. "I did, but Potter and Weasley didn't believe me," Hermione said angrily. "They even told me to mind my own business." "That's fine then," Ralph said dismissively. "You can't reason with that damned ghost. I told you not to meddle." "If they weren't Gryffindor students, who would want to get involved?" Hermione huffed. "Gryffindor's house points are already at the bottom. Professor McGonagall is very unhappy. It's a matter of collective honor. If they get caught, Gryffindor will lose points, so you came to me wanting me to persuade them." Ralph raised an eyebrow. "Yes, they seem to listen to you a lot." Ralph shook his head. "Hermione, if you think like this, even if you stop them this time, they'll still fall for it next time. Only by truly learning a lesson can they remember. Of course, they might never learn until one day they cause something big." Ralph chuckled. "But what if they do learn their lesson? After this punishment, they won't cause trouble for the school again. Your intervention wasn't a good thing. Letting them escape this time only encourages a mentality of taking chances, and they'll only become more brazen in the future." Hermione frowned. Of course, she knew this, but it was Gryffindor who got points deducted. "You're not thinking of reporting them to Professor McGonagall, are you?" Ralph sighed, looking at the girl's expression. "I advise you not to." "Why?" "They'll both know you reported them. Even if they don't say it, they'll hold a grudge," Ralph explained patiently. "If word gets out, the Gryffindor students won't like you, even if you're doing it for Gryffindor's sake." Hermione whispered, "I don't have many friends in Gryffindor anyway." "If you don't have friends, go make some," Ralph said, speechless. "Introduce your roommate to me." "No, I mean, introduce me to your roommate's pet. That way, you'll make friends." "Right, besides, you don't have any evidence. Even if they get scolded, they'll still come out at night," Ralph advised. "Then I'll tell Prefect Percy." You think Percy doesn't go out at night? I saw him getting food from the kitchen last time." Ralph picked up a cup of tea, took a sip, and finally said seriously, "Hermione, put aside your helpfulness and respect other people's fate." Hermione looked conflicted, but she was already mostly convinced. Ralph suddenly thought that with Harry and Ron, those two troublemakers, distracting Filch, wouldn't going to the library be safer? What was hesitating for? Tonight's the night out. Hermione stared into Ralph's eyes, her eyebrows raised high, and slowly said, "You don't want to go out at night too, do you?" While they were distracting Filch, "You're going to the library to catch that bookworm, yeah, will you help?" Ralph laughed. "Help you, my foot. I'm going to report you to Dumbledore, thanks to Just Love to Wonder in the Water and Transforming Rain in the Fields for their generous donations." Chapter 47 The King of Thieves. Hogwarts Castle, bustling with activity during the day, is like a vibrant, energetic girl next door, but at night, it sheds its glitz and clamor, transforming into a mysterious, veiled witch, silent and aloof. This high and mighty witch lies there, immobile, waiting for you to explore, discover, and understand her countless times. Therefore, a nighttime visit to Hogwarts is a forbidden activity suitable for all ages, signifying that you've truly entered the castle's secret territory. During your nighttime visit, you can randomly accept quests, engage in a battle of wits with the Warden Filch, have a brutal fight with Peeves, or even raid the potions office to steal Snape's hidden treasures. In this game, every little wizard can find immense satisfaction. The prerequisite is, you don't get caught. This is the first law of nighttime visits. To avoid being caught, Ralph endured for a long time, and after mastering the magic of the invisible beast and figuring out the layout of Hogwarts, he was finally ready to embark on his first nighttime visit. That night, after his roommate fell asleep, Ralph got up and woke Neville, whispering, "Let's go." Neville hadn't wanted to go out at night, he was a thoroughly honest boy, without a trace of arrogance. But Ralph said he couldn't manage alone, so as a friend, he had to come along. Ralph couldn't help but sigh, realizing he had a rare advantage: he could always guide his friends in a better direction with his personal charm. If he were a professor at Hogwarts in the future, he would definitely be the best teacher. The two changed their clothes, and Ralph headed towards the door. Grode, the botricle, had already opened the door, waiting for them to leave. With a leap, it closed the wooden door and landed on Ralph's shoulder. As they crossed the first-floor hall, Ralph glanced at Filch's office and could still see Malfoy in solitary confinement, sitting at his desk copying the Hogwarts rules. Mrs. Norris, now quite plump, was squatting by the door, yawning. Ralph had already used invisibility to make himself and Neville invisible, so Mrs. Norris couldn't detect them. The library was on the second floor of the castle. When Rove arrived, Sherry had already been there. She had changed back into her simple jeans and faded canvas shoes so she could run faster during the escape. After waiting a while, Rove glanced at the time and said with some disappointment, "Looks like Hermione isn't here yet." "Oh well, let's not wait for her." The three entered the library, and Rove suddenly stopped, looking into the depths of the library and squinting. A white light appeared there, shooting straight towards the three of them. They were already being captured so soon after starting their nighttime adventure? Were all firsts this short? A brown-haired girl emerged from behind the bookshelves, holding a wand with a glowing tip. She pointed it at the three of them, raised her eyebrows, and said, "Got you. Hufflepuff loses 100 points. Cryfinder gains 100 points. Didn't you say you weren't coming?" Rove laughed. "I really wasn't coming." Hermione strode over and snorted, "I'm going to the headmaster's office to report you. Professor Dumbledore sent me to the library to arrest you and Neville, not you." Hermione gave Sherry a sweet smile. Ralph placed a black box on the ground, opened it, and looked up, saying, "When I came here, I ran into Professor Dumbledore in the kitchen. He was getting supper and didn't mention you at all." "You're lying." The girl crossed her arms and snorted. "Likewise." Sherry smiled and ruffled Hermione's hair, removing the cobwebs that had clung to the ends of her hair while she was hiding in the corner. Ralph took a glass lamp from the box. He breathed on it gently, and a swarm of fireflies gathered inside immediately scattered, fluttering around inside the lampshade. These are fireflies. They can communicate using luciferin at a certain distance. We'll use this to transmit information. Ralph caught 4 fireflies from the glass lamp and placed them in 4 small bottles. He looked up and assigned tasks. "Neville, you hide near the library entrance and keep watch for anyone coming. If anyone does, Tap the bottle to make your firefly flash its tail twice. The other fireflies will then flash twice as well. Neville was a little excited, helping with lookout for the first time. He picked up a bottle and promised, "Yes, I'll complete the task, you too." Ralph looked at Hermione and Sherry. "You'll come with me to find silverfish in the library. The library is large. We'll each monitor 3 areas. If anyone finds trace of silverfish, make the fireflies flash once." Ralph handed them the bottles and emphasized, "Pay close attention to the messages the fireflies transmit." Hermione took the bottle, her eyes wide with curiosity as she stared at the beautiful firefly. She was even more curious, why did Ralph always manage to pull out all sorts of strange and wonderful things? Shirley tied the small bottle to her wrist with a hair tie, shook it, and asked doubtfully, "Are we just going to search for the bookworm book by book like this?" "Of course not." Ralph pulled several books made of ream leather from the box. They were clearly ancient. Bookworms feed on books, and the older the book, the more delicious it is to them. But it's been in the Hogwarts library for so long, it should have tasted almost all the old books. Ralph carefully touched the leather books, saying, "These are books passed down in our family. They're different from the ones in the library that it's already tasted. This should definitely lure it out." I sprinkled some dye on the books. When hunting invisible beasts in Romania, hunters use this stuff. Once an animal eats it, its body will temporarily emit a golden glow. Rover rubbed his hands together like a fly scratching its claws, grinning mischievously. "Once that silverfish takes the bait, will he?" Sherry and Hermione watched Rover grin from ear to ear. Hermione touched the goosebumps on her arm, saying fearfully, "Your smile is so sinister, almost like a villain in a movie." Rover rolled his eyes at her, saying, "That's called a friendly smile. Besides, I'm the good guy." The boy took out a galleon, flicked it lightly, and held it in his hand. A clattering sound came from inside the box, and a moment later, a niffler flew out. Rover leaned back, raised his hand, and caught it. He laughed. "Once the silverfish turns golden, the rest can be left to the world's best thief." Rover waved his hand, saying, "All right, let's get to work." Sitting on a low chair, Malfoy swayed back and forth as if his bottom had grown grass. Not far away, Filch was fiddling with chains. He had just been whipping a skeleton with a leather whip. Filch's cat sat nearby, staring at Malfoy with dead fish eyes, which made him even more uneasy. Malfoy instinctively leaned back, almost falling to the ground, before remembering that he was sitting on a bench. "What's wrong? You still have an hour before your detention ends." Filch's eyes were constantly on Malfoy. "Mr. Filch, I want to report something to you," Malfoy said. "There are students out at night, who..." Filch stroked his whip, a forced smile on his face. "If your information is accurate, I might consider reducing your detention time by 5 minutes. The miraculously alive Harry Potter and his little sidekick Weasley." Filch paused, taken aback. "I'm not lying to you. This morning, I overheard them talking about going to vandalize the prize room on the 3rd floor tonight, and even saying they'd throw a horse manure on it. Go there now, we'll definitely catch them," Malfoy said. "Damn it, you bastards. That's a place I cleaned so many times, those scoundrels," Filch cursed. "Why isn't there a single student as polite and disciplined as Mr. Scamander?" Malfoy felt a lump in his throat. Scamander was polite and disciplined? He was the one who should be expelled. "You're not lying to me, trying to lure me away so you can vandalize my office, are you?" Filch stared intently at Malfoy. "I'm not lying to you, I swear on my honor as dean," Malfoy swore. Filch stood up, giving a cold snort. "Then you're coming with me. If I catch those two, your detention tonight can end early. If you lie, I'll make you clean the toilet in the bathroom, thanks to the generous donation from Just Love Waiting in the Water." Chapter 48. He fled. He chased, but there was no escape. Walking down the dimly lit corridors, Harry and Ron felt their first nighttime stroll was going almost unbelievably smoothly. Since leaving Gryffindor Tower, they had walked a long way without encountering any prefects, ghosts, professors, or even the warden, Filch. They hadn't even gotten lost on the stairs. It was as leisurely as a stroll in their own backyard. "George and Fred told me nighttime strolls were dangerous," Ron said dismissively. "Is that all?" "Yeah, and Granger too. I thought she'd report us, or come out at night to stop us," Harry said, somewhat surprised. "Did she say she was going to find Ralph?" "She hasn't said a word since she came back. Ralph probably convinced her," Ron guessed. "I wonder how Ron can stand being friends with someone like that," Ron's probably just too good-natured, Harry sighed. He probably can't say no to people. The two tiptoed down the corridor toward the third floor. As they neared the prize room, Ron tugged at Harry and whispered, "Are you ready, Harry?" "Yeah, but I'm still a little nervous." "It's okay, it's my first time too. I hope it ends soon. We have class tomorrow, can't stay up too long." "I'm scared." "Don't be scared, I'm actually pretty good." The two entered the prize room. The crystal glass cases gleamed in the moonlight, the trophies, shields, medals, and statues shimmering with silver and gold. But Malfoy and his henchmen were nowhere to be seen. Harry took out his wand, just in case Malfoy suddenly burst in and attacked him, but time ticked by, and still no one appeared. Could it really be a hoax, as Granger said? Harry hesitated. Although Ron was somewhat convinced they might have been tricked, he didn't want to admit it and stubbornly insisted, "Malfoy might be late, or maybe he's too scared to come, maybe he's waiting for you two with his men." Filch suddenly jumped out from the corner, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Harry Potter, the boy who survived, and a Weasley. I've been wanting to kick your twin brothers out for ages, but I caught the younger one first. Looks like you're nowhere near as smart as your brothers." Filch grinned from ear to ear, revealing a mouthful of uneven, yellow teeth. "Tonight is truly a double celebration." Malfoy stood to the side, a smirk on his face. He stared at Harry's face and said smugly, "You got tricked, didn't you? Potter, I'm in solitary confinement. How come you're still sleeping freely in your dormitory?" Ron was about to curse Malfoy when Harry yelled, "Run, don't even think about running." Filch roared, blocking the way with his small body, but he couldn't stop the two of them at all. Mrs. Norris pounced, slapping Ron across the face. Ron, in pain, flung him away, sending him crashing into Malfoy's face. Malfoy's face was also scratched by the enraged Mrs. Norris. Filch scooped up Mrs. Norris and chased after them in a frenzy, his eyes blazing with anger as he shouted, "You're all getting away." Malfoy, dazed, stood up, ignoring the claw marks on his face, and gave chase. But he was a few steps too slow, and after navigating several corridors, he couldn't see Filch anymore. Most importantly, he was lost. Malfoy had no choice but to chase in a random direction. Harry and Ron circled around doorposts, running through corridor after corridor, completely lost, disappearing into holes and staircases, running aimlessly. "We should have shaken them off by now," Harry panted, leaning against a cold wall, wiping the sweat from his brow. Ron, also bent over, panted, "But Filch has seen us. It's all right, as long as we get back to the common room, that's all. Filch can't get into the Gryffindor Tower, so we'll just deny ever going out for a night stroll tomorrow." This was the only solution Harry could think of, albeit a desperate one. That despicable Malfoy, that coward. He's Slytherin. We shouldn't have believed his lies, Ron cursed. Harry was speechless. "Why didn't you say that earlier? You even agreed to duel with me tonight." The two rested for a while and continued on, but after walking only a dozen meters, they saw a door open. Peeves sprang out of a classroom. Seeing the two young wizards, he shrieked happily, "The little wizards are out at night. The little wizards aren't sleeping in the middle of the night." "Shut up, Peeves, please, you'll get us expelled," Harry pleaded. He really wanted to learn the spell Ron used to banish Peeves. Peeves continued to chuckle. "Annoying freshman, wandering around in the middle of the night. Tisk, you'll get arrested." "No, as long as you don't betray us, Peeves, please." "I'm going to tell Filch," Peeves said seriously, but his eyes gleamed with mischief. "This is for your own good, you know. Nighttime wanderings are prohibited at school. Get out of here," Ron said fiercely, reaching out to slap Peeves hard. This provocation undoubtedly angered Peeves, who roared, "Bullying ghosts. Students aren't sleeping, they're bullying ghosts." There in the charms hallway, Harry was speechless. He started running again, and at the end of the corridor, he crashed heavily into a figure. It was the lost Malfoy. Malfoy was knocked to the ground, hitting a suit of armor, making a clattering sound throughout the floor. He cursed, "Which bastard is walking around at night without eyes?" He looked up and saw Harry, then shouted again, "I caught Potter, I caught him, hurry, Filch." Ouch! Malfoy was kicked by Harry, hitting his little Malfoy squarely. Ron also picked up the armor and threw it at Malfoy. The two seemed to have no intention of running away, thinking they would give Malfoy a good beating before being caught. Malfoy, enduring the pain in his groin, got up and ran, with Harry and Weasley in hot pursuit. He fled, he was chased, There was no escape. Peeves shouted from the side, "They're fighting! They're fighting!" Malfoy reached the end of the road, where there was only a door, but it was locked. He couldn't open it at all, and not far away, Harry and Ron were chasing after him menacingly. Peeves floated beside Malfoy, hands on his hips, a mocking smile flashing in his eyes. "Call me Grandpa Peeves, and I'll open the door for you. I, Peeves, always keep my word." Malfoy, ever the opportunist, immediately shouted, "Grandpa Peeves, open the door now." Peeves smiled contentedly. He pulled out a wire from somewhere, fiddled with it in the keyhole a few times, and with a click, the door opened. Malfoy immediately darted inside, intending to close the door, but Harry rushed forward, wedging the door with his foot and then slamming into it. Malfoy was knocked to the ground, and Harry stumbled in, only to trip over Malfoy and fall heavily on top of him. Ron also squeezed in, bumping into Harry and landing squarely on top of him. Harry looked on in horror, for he realized his mouth was being pressed against Malfoy's. There was no way to avoid it. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49: A Woman's Sigh. In the Hogwarts library, Ralph wandered through the forbidden section, carrying a bottle filled with fireflies. The forbidden section was a spacious, square room with dark wood floors and ceilings, and 12 bookshelves filled with magical books. Ralph scanned the dimly lit room, searching for a catalog, a bound encyclopedia listing the entire collection of the forbidden section. The catalog would help Ralph quickly understand the types of books in the forbidden section, and he planned to take a look to see if there were any he needed. He wasn't sure if he'd caught any bookworms in the forbidden section, but he couldn't leave empty-handed. However, he walked to the very end of the forbidden section without finding the catalog, but on the last bookshelf, he spotted a huge, transparent magical cabinet. Peering through the cabinet, Ralph saw a very old leather box, clearly used to protect a massive ancient book. There were words on the outside of the box, but they were difficult to decipher. As Rove observed, a magical creature with silvery gray scales and 9 barbels at the end of its abdomen poked its head out of a book. The bookworm sniffed deeply, inhaling the rich scent of the book, which carried a sense of historical weight. It closed its eyes in rapture, then slowly opened them and emerged from the book. With a leap, like a seal diving into the water, the book swung its tail gracefully and landed inside the leather book. It tumbled joyfully among the words, devouring the text and magic. Its entire body then emitted a dazzling golden light. Rove's gaze remained fixed on his magic book. He flicked the bottle, causing the firefly's tail to flash, then patted the box. "It's you, Niffler." A Niffler sprang from the box, leaping high into the air and lunging forward. A meter above the ground, its claws suddenly extended, landing lightly like a wildcat. Seeing the Niffler approach, the bookworm immediately emerged from the book, leaping to one side and effortlessly traversing a stack of thick spellbooks, preparing to escape the scene of the crime. The Niffler, with a quick tap of its paw, darted out, climbing the bookshelves. When it landed on a spellbook, it waddled a few times before regaining its balance and continuing its ascent. Ralph quickly reached out and caught the falling spellbook, which opened with a piercing, chilling scream. The boy gave it a hard slap, followed by a powerful punch that knocked it unconscious, then closed the book and gently placed it back on the shelf. Hermione and Sherry, having received the message, arrived with bottles, each releasing the Niffler Ralph had given them. The bookworm moved swiftly through the library, its speed like a thin, yet unyielding golden thread, followed by 3 persistent Nifflers. The Nifflers, as agile as monkeys, darted and weaved among the bookshelves. The silverfish, exhausted from the chase, rushed towards the magic cabinet containing the ancient books. Just as it was about to slip inside, a Niffler spun around and caught it midair. Ralph rushed over, but the Niffler stuffed the silverfish into its pouch, refusing to hand it over. "I'll trade this," Ralph said, pulling out a large, gleaming piece of brass. The Nifflers like to judge the price of something by its size and shine. It compared the large silverfish in its hand to the palm-sized brass and immediately agreed. Ralph grabbed the silverfish, preparing to examine it, when a gust of wind blew. And all the books in the forbidden area suddenly turned their pages, making a rustling sound. The rows of bookshelves, protruding from the walls like ribs, combined with the sound of turning pages, created an eerie feeling, as if the entire library were alive. Ralph was instantly chilled to the bone. Because he heard a woman sigh, low and light, like the wind blowing through his body. "Are you a Hogwarts student?" "Who?" Ralph called out. But the voice was intermittent and quickly disappeared. Hermione and Sherry came over. Sherry asked, "What's wrong? Did you two hear a woman speaking softly?" Sherry and Hermione both shook their heads. Ralph frowned, staring at the dark library, but the voice had completely vanished, as if it had never been there. Inside the room, Malfoy was completely stunned. Coming to his senses, he immediately clutched his throat and roared, "I'm going to kill you, Potter." "What have you done, you bastard?" Harry lay on the floor retching, yelling, "I'm going to kill you." The two then grappled and started fighting again. Ron wanted to team up with Harry for a mixed doubles fight, but he felt as if it were raining in the room, with wet droplets falling on him. He looked up and let out a piercing scream. Harry and Malfoy stopped at the sound and looked up to see a monstrous dog staring at them. The dog was as big as the room, with 3 heads, 3 pairs of menacing, darting eyes, and drool dripping from its mouth onto the 3 of them. "Ah!" Filch, carrying Mrs. Norris, hurried towards the 4th floor restricted corridor. He had already heard the commotion in the 2nd floor library, but he planned to catch Potter and Weasley first before going back to deal with the other group of nocturnal wizards. Tonight's prey was plentiful. Which way did they go, Peeves? Filch frowned as he entered the corridor, seeing no one. "Hurry up and tell me," "Say please." Peeves floated in midair. "Don't mess with me, Peeves. Where did they go?" "I won't say anything to you unless you say please," Peeves said in his annoying, humming tone. "All right, please tell me." "What?" "Huh. I told you, if you don't say please, I won't tell you what." "Huh. Ha ha ha," Filch cursed Peeves angrily. He was about to turn and leave when Malfoy yelled, flung open the door, and rushed out, Harry and Ron following closely behind. Cerberus crashed in, one head squeezing out of the doorway, growling and staring at the 3 fleeing wizards. "Monster!" Malfoy shouted, immediately hiding behind Filch. Harry and Ron, having escaped, collapsed to the ground, their limbs weak. Filch looked at Fulvey, whose head was stuck, and chuckled, "This is a treasure Professor Dumbledore brought here. I warned you both not to come to the forbidden area, and you didn't listen." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and cuffed Harry and Ron's hands, saying menacingly, "First you caused trouble in the Triumphs display room, and now you've trespassed into the forbidden area. Come on. Let's go see Professor Snape. He'll be happy to see you too, thanks to the generous donor's nightlight. Happy Town, just love to wander in the water, and book friends 33,021,209,008,549 for their donations." Chapter 50 Shrinking Potion. Before Filch arrived at the library, Ralph had already sneaked out with Hermione and the others. The Niffler's catching of silverfish had been too noisy. The professors on several floors had probably been woken up. The stairs were out of the question, so Ralph led them to a wall on the 2nd floor where a portrait of Derwent Simpling hung. Derwent Simpling was a wizard comedian who, during a bet, ate an entire poisonous tentacle. Although he didn't die, his skin turned purple, turning him into a miniature purple sweet potato. Ralph tapped the portrait and whispered the command, "Belly button." The purple sweet potato, Derwent Simpling, opened the portrait, revealing a small secret passage, which Ralph crawled into first. The 3 followed behind. Hermione surveyed the long, narrow space, utterly astonished, and exclaimed in disbelief, "I've passed by here several times and never knew there was a secret passage. Since it's a secret passage, isn't it normal that you didn't know?" Ralph stood in the passage, studying a map by the light of the fireflies. He had prepared a contingency plan for this situation. He had several routes to safely escort Hermione and Sherry back to their respective lounges without using the stairs. Bringing the 2 girls out for a thrilling nighttime adventure in the middle of the night, he couldn't very well leave them without taking them back to their lounges, letting them climb the stairs and get caught by the professors, could he? That would be too cruel. Even his grandfather, Scamander, wouldn't do something so naive. Hermione continued, "How did you know there was a secret passage here?" The young girl possessed a strong thirst for knowledge, or rather, her curiosity about Ralph was inexhaustible. She always wanted to uncover all his secrets. Ralph waved the map in his hand and said softly, "This is a gift from Filch after I rescued Lady Lawrence." He summarized some shortcuts and staircase patterns within the castle. "Filch would do something like this," Hermione exclaimed in surprise, narrowing her eyes and glancing at the map out of the corner of her eye. "Isn't everyone saying he's terrible with his students?" Ralph looked up, His smile warm, and patiently explained, "Don't let a person's appearance or what others say influence your judgment. That's the most important thing." The boy added, "Like me, many people misunderstand me. Actually, I'm a good kid who's not good with the words, honest and sincere, and a little socially awkward." "It might be more convincing if you didn't add that last sentence," Sherry said, crossing her arms and gently raising her eyebrows. Hermione suppressed a laugh and nodded vigorously. Ralph rolled his eyes at Sherry, thinking, even you've picked up some bad habits from Hermione. His eyes held a threatening glint. "Little assistant, subordinates shouldn't kiss their superiors. Be careful, or your salary will be docked this month." Hearing that there was no more movement outside, Ralph set off again, passing through several secret passages to reach the 4th floor. Passing through the restricted area, Ralph glanced at the corridor not far away, which Dumbledore had strictly forbidden him from entering, as if his attention was completely drawn to it. "That's forbidden territory, don't even think about it," Hermione warned, seeing through the boy's thoughts immediately. "I won't let you go in, I'll just take a look, I won't go in." Ralph unconsciously walked towards that direction. Ralph really didn't go in, not because he didn't want to, but because the entrance was too small. He was stuck. Literally stuck. From afar, Ralph saw the large head of the three-headed dog, Fulvy, seemingly trying to squeeze out of the door, but stuck at the entrance, unable to go in or out, letting out a pitiful whimper. As Ralph approached, the three-headed dog let out a threatening hissing, spitting saliva all over the ground, but it was no use, its head was stuck. The once fierce, unapproachable three-headed dog suddenly became weak and vulnerable. Even Neville, the most timid of them all, after his initial fear, dared to pet the vicious dog's head. What kind of washing machine plot is this? And it's Rove's favorite series. Rove reached out and flicked Louis's black nose, when suddenly a ding sounded in his brain. An adult domesticated Cerberus has been detected, triggering side quest 1, help the Cerberus free its stuck head. Reward, magic, functional excitement, consumes physical magic to activate your physical functions, greatly increasing your speed, strength, and mental focus, maintaining a state of excitement. Side quest 2, help the Cerberus clean its teeth. Reward, magic, beast's mouth, your teeth can secrete toxic substances, creatures bitten by you will have difficulty healing. Side quest 3, complete 100% taming of the Cerberus. Reward, magic, Cerberus seal, you can grow 3 heads. Mission incomplete. Ralph glanced at the system. This was the most ridiculous reward he'd ever seen. If it could grow 3 organs, well, he could accept it. But 3 heads? Forget it. The first 2 rewards weren't bad, especially the first one, functional excitement, which was practically a stimulant effect. Since that's the case, we need to get its head out, Ralph said. But how? Neville asked. Ralph glanced at the wall and said, blow this wall up. Good suggestion, Hermione snorted. We'll be fired tomorrow for damaging the castle. That's too violent, Ralph said softly. We can shrink Cerberus's body so its head can retract. Will a shrinking charm work? Sherry asked. Given the magical resistance of Cerberus's fur, if several of us use the shrinking charm together, casting it all night, it might shrink a little. Ralph shook his head. What do we do then? The boy rummaged through the black leather case, and after a moment, pulled out a bottle of bright green potion. This is a shrinking potion. It can shrink the drinker's body or transform them into a younger form. The shrinking potion was very powerful, only a small amount was needed to take effect. It was also a common method used when capturing dragons in Romania. Open your mouth and drink the potion. Ralph originally wouldn't have been able to force the potion into Louis's mouth, since it only ate food given by Hagrid. But now that its head was stuck, it had no choice. Ralph punched Louis's nose with his fist, and the moment the latter involuntarily opened its mouth, he shoved the entire bottle of potion into it. Then, several people held its mouth shut. Louis struggled all over, but its body began to shrink. In just a few minutes, it went from a several-meter-tall adult giant dog to a puppy the size of a palm. Ralph entered the room, and Louis pounced on him, tearing at his trouser leg like a vicious dog pouncing on its prey. The tiny, young three-headed dog posed no threat whatsoever. The boy lifted Fluffy by the scruff of its neck, gave it a smack on the rump, and tossed it into his black leather trunk. He'd return it in a couple of days after cleaning its teeth. That should be fine, right? Standing at the door of the potions office, staring at Harry and Ron, Professor McGonagall was angrier than ever before. Suppressing her anger, she said. Mr. Filch says you two went to the prize room on the 3rd floor to vandalize it, and after being discovered, you even ran to the restricted area on the 4th floor. Malfoy tried to stop you, and you two even hit him? Explain yourselves. Harry and Ron realized there really had nothing to explain. Aside from not vandalizing the prize room, everything else was undeniable. Well, saying they went to duel might be worse, since it was a fight. Snape smiled smugly to himself. He said softly, Professor McGonagall, I don't know if you're recalling anything, but Potter's behavior reminds me of his father, exactly the same, isn't it? Harry looked up and glared at Snape. Snape stared into his eyes and said coldly, Greedy, Professor, 2 points deducted from Gryffindor. I'm furious, said Professor McGonagall. Both of you will be put in detention, and Gryffindor will lose another 50 points, 50 points each, Professor McGonagall said coldly. Professor, please, you can't. Why didn't you plead earlier? Professor McGonagall said indifferently. All right, go back to the common room. I don't want to see either of you tonight. I've never felt so ashamed for Gryffindor students. On the 4th floor, in the restricted area, Dumbledore, wearing his pajamas, pushed up his half-moon spectacles and looked at the empty room, somewhat troubled. How should he tell Hagrid? His little dog was lost. P.S. Shrinking potion was brewed by Harry's 3rd-year students. It wasn't a particularly rare or precious potion. Snape even fed Lyford a potion made by Neville after class, and with Hermione's help, Lyford successfully turned back into a tadpole after drinking it. Secondly, the shrinking potion has 2 effects. One is simply shrinking the body, and the other is reverting to infancy. As for when which effect takes effect, the original work doesn't say, so I can only assume it's related to dosage. Rowling also added some official information. Bucky accidentally spilled some shrinking potion on the lawn outside the house, resulting in a lamb being shrunk to the size of a fluffy little mouse. He also gave the potion to the Tertius brothers, and they both shrunk to the size of beetles, hiding under the cupboard for several days to avoid being found and eaten by their cat. So, the shrinking potion definitely works on Fluffy. Many potions are powerful and have wondrous uses. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.